It all kicks off inside a breathtaking church, where a small crowd squeezes in together, drawn in by something they can't ignore. A bunch of priests stood up front at the altar while people dropped to their knees all around them. Then one priest raised his voice and announced the result for Klaus Noldor. The priest boomed that this guy's gift was called automation, and the crowd erupted into whispers because nobody had a clue what it meant, even though everyone had heard his name for the first time in their lives, while Klaus stayed locked on his knees, silent and unmoving. 15-year-old Klaus snapped up from his knees because the priest was just hyping how automation was an insanely rare gift, and they had someone in the room with a one-of-a-kind skill. The knights who watched the ceremony leaned in and declared, "Recruit him into the Metropolitan Order, no doubt." But right then, another crowd snapped into a fight of their own, shouting that he should join their guild instead. A joyful Klaus stared at his own hands and thought, "Sure, I've got a bunch of unique skills, but I can already feel it. I'm about to unlock something insanely powerful." Klaus tilted his head to the sky, wondering if one day he'd become the kind of adventurer everyone talks about, while dreams and hopes swept right over him. Soon, the wind screamed through the misty forest, and Klaus stood there, alone, staring into the dark like he'd just remembered what it felt like to think that way before. 3 long years have passed, and he's still got nothing to show. He's already 18, with a measly 10th level standing. Klaus decided to break down exactly what this automation is all about. At the very first skill level, he unlocked Auto Return, a power that lets him slip back home straight from the dungeon. Yep, that's exactly what he did. The second skill level was Auto Displacement, and it let him zip automatically between countries without breaking a sweat. That was all the message was saying when he finally snapped back to his senses. He was already standing at his destination, nothing more. Then Cloud exploded in a shout, telling him it had been over 2 years and he was still stuck as a low-level novice adventurer. He clenched his fists, convinced he'd snap any minute, because guild members kept treating him like trash, shouting that he was useless. They laughed in Klaus's face, sneering that his skills meant nothing, and urged him to quit his life altogether. Someone looked him dead in the eye and said Klaus was nothing, an empty shell. They demanded to know what he could possibly do, told him to flip the direction of his choices, and then threw in a cruel laugh like it was a joke, but nobody was willing to give him a chance. Those words cut deep. He wasn't about to quit. Klaus was battling goblins, and once he wiped out the little ones, he stormed straight into the forest to take on their boss, the hobgoblins. He raised a tiny dagger in front of him, and Klaus panted hard as he vowed he'd end that monster right here, right now. He blurted out that this was the first time he'd ever gone to the cleanup alone after 3 solid years of training as an adventurer, pushing himself every single day to become better. Klaus sprinted straight at the monster, just as it lifted its baton for a brutal swing. Then he struck the goblin's arm and snapped the weapon around to drive in a second hit. In the blink of an eye, he spun around and sliced clean through the monster's torso. Begoblin crumpled dead, sprawled behind Klaus as he rose calmly, fighting for breath. He couldn't believe it somehow. He'd actually managed to kill a hobgoblin. When he finally found his breath, he strode over to the monster's body. Now rip the top of the goblin's muscle off, then yank the hobgoblin's magic stone straight out of its chest. The main character yanked a stone straight out of the hobgoblin and held it up in his palm like it was about to explode. Klaus hoisted his blade again and declared that this stone was way bigger than any ordinary goblin's. Then he swung hard and slammed it with his steel. The stone shattered like it was made of glass, and the goblin's soul burst out right then. Klaus's stats skyrocketed, pushing him straight up to level 11. Right after that, he flashed an awkward smile. Klaus let out a breath and admitted he was finally hyped, though part of him already feared the 10th level was the ceiling, since he'd been stuck there for far too long. The main character snapped open his stats and said he figures his peers hit level 50 in just 3 years. Then he let out a heavy sigh, admitting there was no reason to envy what they had. He yanked his stats glasses into place and snapped that he'd be better off focusing on himself, then immediately started rushing to pull them on tighter to boost the automation. Cloud flashed a grin and announced he'd finally broken through to the 3rd level of his skill. Then he tapped it fast, praying it would actually pay off. At that moment, he raged through every cruel word people hurled at him, mocking both the guy and his skills as useless because of his abilities. Right before he pressed the button, those taunts were all he could think about, and all he could do was pray it would actually turn into something useful. Plus slammed the upgrade button, and right at level 3, that skill let him auto-collect resources with 0 effort. He gawked in disbelief at what landed in his lap, then couldn't stop replaying it in his head, begging himself to make sense of the impossible thing he'd imagined. The image didn't shift at all, same scene, no change, and the moment he saw that, the guy crumpled to the ground in pure despair, unable to accept that this was nothing more than an automatic grind for resources. That desperate guy slumped on the floor, utterly crushed, like he couldn't wrap his head around how it all ended up like this. Then Cloud exploded into hysterical laughter. He said, "Expectations only sour you," and the people from the past kept dropping smart truths. Then he prayed for some automatic treatment, or even a rocking ride, but all he got was calm, steady work picking grass. And that was it. he was done for today. He hit the automatic homecoming skill, and a timer snapped into place by the time it hit 0. He was already at the front door, fuming. He burst into the house and announced himself, and right away, his sweet little sister, Liz, greeted him. She demanded, "Why are you back so late?" Klaus flashed that weird smile, then rushed out an apology. He said he'd taken a long hike after checking him from head to toe, and the girl erupted in a scream, "You're filthy again." She shoved him hard in the back, driving him straight into the house, then ordered him to take a bath before dinner, preferably right now, while Klaus begged her, "Please don't push me so rough." The girl insisted that no matter what happened, he still crushed it, and Klaus thanked her for those kind words. After a little while, the girl hustled to set the table and announced they'd be eating stale, dark bread tonight, plus a hearty stew of Chinese cabbage with bacon. He stepped out of the shower, thanked Liz for everything, and promised he'd come find her the second his hair finally dried. She yanked him along and slammed him into the chair at the table, shouting for him to start eating right now. Then she snatched his towel and promised she'd wipe his head herself. She slammed it down fast and fearless, then Cloud shrieked in pain and snapped, "Can you do it yourself?" The girl just smiled and said the stew must be eaten before it turns cold, so he'd better stop being naughty and dig in quietly. She told him that the moment he eats, his mood will flip around, and that made Klaus blink in shock. Then he tried to laugh it off with an awkward little smile. The guy demanded, "So you think it's that obvious from me?" Liz smirked and said it was only natural, then flipped it on him. "So who do you think I am?" Klaus answered, "My little sister." Liz leaned in, voice tight, asking if work was going off the rails again, and Klaus gave a quiet, grim nod, agreeing with her. The girl caught on instantly and shot back. "So it's all about your skill again, right?" The guy stared at the floor, nodded along, then awkwardly swallowed his pride and apologized. Liz didn't get what Klaus was even sorry for, so she pressed him for answers. He snapped that his apology was because he'd been stuck earning too little thanks to her, and the whole thing was hitting her hard. He screamed that her father never came back from the mission, and that his parents who brought them to their place vanished too. Somewhere out there now, he had to find money for both of them. But he just couldn't. When she heard that, Liz's heart sank. She shoved into Klaus with a tight hug and cut off his monologue, leaving him frozen as the startled guy blurted, "What are you doing?" Liz leaned in and asked if her hug made things feel any easier for him. He blushed hard and shot back that it wasn't like that his brother shouldn't act like it was better to mess with his sister's chest, and Liz immediately asked if he was mixing things up. She said he was still just a kid, yet he already had to work, and she swore it was obvious he was suffering way more than she was, so she told her brother to stop talking like that. She asked him straight up if he'd actually listened to her about it, and Klaus awkwardly turned toward her, only for her to cut him off before he could even get a word out. Liz cut him off and told him to stop fretting about his skill, because at the start, it didn't really help much. She stared him down and said, "I'm turning 15 real soon, and when I do, I'll finally unlock my skill, and if everything goes right, I'll make sure you're taken care of." She pressed a kiss to his forehead and told him, "Let's stay like this until then." Then she awkwardly scooted back like she couldn't help herself. Startled, Klaus stared at the girl. She looked totally unbothered by what she'd just done, and then she bolted up and sprinted out of the room. Klaus stared at her in disbelief and asked where she was headed, because she was still just a kid herself. Liz snapped back, "I went to bed." Klaus just stood there, frozen, as she spun back and declared that she was finally done being okay with him only coming home. She flashed a smile, wished her brother good night, and Klaus just couldn't find the words to reply. Once she was gone, a grin lit up his face inside. Thanks to her, he finally felt better, and he vowed that tomorrow he'd go all out. That evening, Klaus ate in total silence because he still had no idea about what was coming. That laughable special skill everyone was mocking. It was about to wake up that night because Klaus didn't even know the real worth of his third automation level. Trust me, once it kicks in, you'll hit your goal for real because this automation feature is the one thing that makes it happen. He stood in the poisonous swamp, the place where resources are ripped from the ground, waiting for the next big thing, and the very next day he came back only to stare in disbelief at what he'd found. A tiny splash of the XZO antidote herb was scattered on the ground where he'd left it yesterday, and the clouds demanded, how is that even possible? He scooped up the grass in his hands, checked it like it mattered, and asked how it was doing today. He'd taken the job to collect an antidote herb and headed to this place, even as the gloom clung to everything like it always did. He fired up his skill, muttered that it probably wouldn't do a thing, then went for it anyway. Then he activated the grass auto assemblies. Suddenly, he froze right in front of him, the loot split into countless sections, thousands of names stretching ahead, and he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Klaus carefully crushed the antidote herbs, forcing out a shaky laugh like, "No way this could just work." And then the system demanded the guy list exactly how many resources he'd need to gather. He was totally thrown off, but he still stepped in and entered 30 units. Then Klaus nearly couldn't believe it when the system promised he'd gather all 30 units of grass in just 4 minutes. Klaus let out a shaky laugh, realizing that if it was that simple, one single herb would suck in every 10 seconds. The moment Cloud hit the timer, Time basically vanished, and when he finally snapped back to consciousness, he was staring at a solid patch of grass right in front of him. He couldn't shake the feeling this was all some kind of joke. Then Klaus snapped into action and barreled straight for the system. The main character figured it was time to hunt for something rarer than the antidote herb, and his eyes landed on the petrified grass. The system flashed the collection time, and right at the end, this kind of vegetation was already in the stricken guy's hands. He blurted that this petrified herb was way rarer than anything most people ever see, and the price? It was 50 times higher than the antidote herb. Once he was done, he also set his sights on grabbing 10 macho grass pieces, and when the resource time finally ran out, he found that herb sitting right in front of Klaus too, who was grinning like he couldn't wait to get his hands on it. That dude decided to test his luck. How long would it take him to snag the legendary class's rarest grass dragon ear? And you can trade it for an entire castle. He picked one herb and clocked the harvest at 127 hours, then the guy froze. Because that meant it wasn't a quick job, it dragged on past 5 whole days. Klaus burst out laughing and said there was nothing to be shocked about. There wasn't a single place on Earth where this grass could ever grow. Then he stared off into the distance, wondering where he'd land in 5 days, and just like that, he cut himself off. Klaus realized that in only 5 days he could land a dragon spike, the legendary kind, and his skill swore it was true, so he snapped around and started racing to figure out what he'd do next. Klaus could use the time to pinpoint where rare items were hiding nearby, so that's why he hauled himself to a whole new spot to gather supplies, the Gorge of Lamentation. Klaus fought through the poison's grip. Shielded by his gas mask, he let out a strained breath and said he was here. In that hated spot, the Gorge of Lamentation, steeped in a brutal poison. Klaus knew the gorge had the grass he needed, no question about it, and the price tag for every single piece was brutal. But that antidote herb for 1 silver was pocket change compared to this. Klaus picked the mandrake in the system. If the weight hit right, he could rake in up to 10 times more gold, and everyone knows it. It's an insanely rare herb, the legendary mandrake. Klaus timed it 24 minutes to grab the mandrake, and when he saw the clock hit that mark, he burst out, "This is gonna be easy." Then Guy activated the skill. Right then, the timer jerked forward and the digits started racing harder and harder until Klaus finally snapped back to consciousness. The moment he opened his eyes, he froze. There was a lone mandrake sprout growing on his hands, and the happy guy immediately hoisted it up like it was pure magic. Klaus kept grinning and yelling about what he'd done, but the second he did, a terrifying monster loomed right behind him as he thought about Liz. While Klaus was yelling with pure joy about his victory, something surged up behind him, and just like that, the second level of the detection skill kicked in. Just as the cloud shifted, he froze because huge fangs lurked behind him. Then the guy shrieked and stumbled backward. Klaus stared at a massive, starving stone lizard monster inside the classroom, and it whipped its tail, smashing the spot where he'd just been standing. Klaus shot back through the air. Then the poor guy broke down in tears, trapped for good, and Klaus couldn't wrap his head around it. He'd just run into a stone lizard out there. It felt like a total prank, because this place was way too low level, and Cloud couldn't make sense of how a classroom monster could exist here at all. Tears streamed down his cheeks after he'd already decided he was done for. And then, like a cruel flashback, memories of his little sister started slamming into his mind. He was begging her for forgiveness, but the moment hit, his mind went blank, and he couldn't even wrap his head around the idea of leaving her alone. The main character already swore to her that he'd make it back home, and Klaus was dead set on returning too. He didn't even flinch at the fact that he had zero chance of winning. Klaus was still headed home to Dear Liz, but first he raised a dagger right in front of him. A mandrake was sprouting. Suddenly, the stone lizard spun away from him, then his shock hit so hard his eyes watered. Staring at the monster's weird behavior, Klaus caught something else. This thing was gripping a mandrake right in front of him. He yanked the plant even farther, then the stone lizard started spinning in place, clutching its own head, and Klaus instantly realized what could have happened. The instant he yanked the mandrake from the soil, it screamed bloody murder, and the blast of noise dragged in a lizard that got hurt in the chaos. Klaus instantly saw the lizard's health draining as the mandrake shrieked, but he was knocked out during the whole automation. He couldn't see a thing or hear anything, so he snapped his blade up and barreled forward, slamming into the monster crouched on the ground. And as he yelled that this would all be over right here, the stone lizard was still waiting. Blood exploded from the monster in the very next instant. This was a comeback story from the first punch to the last, with Klaus, the guy the whole world despised, stuck with one of the most useless skills ever. Klaus dragged his cargo home, vowing that anyone who treated him like trash would pay for it. Then he stepped inside to find his little sister, Liz, hanging up the laundry. The moment she spotted him, that joyful girl flashed a huge smile and practically greeted him with pure excitement. The Adventurers Guild was dead silent and unnervingly calm. Someone scrubbed the tables before the doors opened, while someone else was still fighting to wake up. Still blinking away the sleep, the guild secretary Taryn stood there, and that sweet smile on her face felt like it was already lighting the day. She whipped her hair into place and said, "All right, time to work." Taryn spun back toward the girls, who looked even more drained, and seeing that they still weren't getting it, she snapped at them. Secretaries were the guild's face, so they needed to wake up. Like, now. The girls whirled to Tareen and confessed they couldn't sleep a wink after yesterday's overtime. And Tareen snapped back that secretaries should always move like graceful white swans smiling bright, never showing a trace of fatigue. The girls snapped that it was all the adventurers' fault, while the secretaries groaned that they'd been buried under nonstop work. Then the adventurers finally stumbled into the guild after a full week and dumped a mountain of loot on everyone. They said if Turan knew how long it would take to sort everything, set a price, then ship it, he'd understand. So Taryn sucked in a deep breath and told them, "Whatever it is, at least make sure you wash up." One of the girls suddenly snapped back, saying she hadn't seen Terrence Ward in ages. The secretary demanded what she meant, and the second girl backed her up, insisting he hadn't shown up for days. They claimed the guy was a veteran, stuck playing the part of a low-rank adventurer, so Taryn figured they meant Klaus. And yeah, she agreed. He'd been missing for way too long. Right then, the guild doors burst open and a voice roared through the hall. Klaus Noldor strode in with mountains of sacks piled up behind him. He grinned like he'd just won, and before anyone could blink, he'd already hit level 19. So when the secretary spotted the Klaus, she froze in shock, especially since he'd hauled so much with him. The girls are already breaking down in tears, convinced this is the same nightmare happening to them again, because none of this was planned, and they're still stuck on one terrifying question: where in the world did he even pull that monster's head from? They dreaded another sleepless night. Then Taryn showed up with a sweet smile and told Klaus he'd come way earlier than usual. When the girls clocked Terrence's actions, their faces went wide with shock, and she just stood there with her hands clasped in a neat little lock, smiling sweetly at the main character, like nothing happened. The secretary grilled the latter about where he'd been, and Klaus told me he trekked to the poisonous swamp, then pushed all the way to the Gorge of Lamentation. Taryn even wondered if he hit both places at once, and honestly, now it's crystal clear why he's got so much loot. Taryn just couldn't figure out what to do because nearly everything out there was unplanned prey. Klaus burst into instant apologies, and the girls were shocked that Taryn didn't even twitch. They said she talked like she was staring straight into a mirror, and that freaked them out on a whole other level. Then the second girl snapped her gaze to Taryn's legs, which were trembling like crazy. The girl stepped up to him and blurted, "Is that really the head of a stone lizard?" She said it was a pretty rare find for the class, so she wanted to stash it for storage or hand it over to the specialist to process it. They figured it out the moment they saw it right there, reflected in her legs. Taryn said the only thing that mattered to her was that Klaus came back safe. The guy shot an awkward apology at her, then started digging through the bags. Klaus leaned in and said he had something else. Then he pulled a small mandrake from his bag, an S-grade material, right as the ground shattered under Terrence's feet. Cloud snapped his head side to side, stunned by that strange sound. Then Terrence shouted his name. She narrowed her eyes and snapped toward the guy, shouting for him to come inside with her. Then Klaus, shaking with fear, blurted out why on earth it had to happen. The girl yanked Klaus along behind her, and the guy kept blurting that he didn't know what he'd done wrong. Sharon snapped that they'd handle him right now, so he better not fight back and just follow her calmly. Right after that, the doors to the room slammed shut behind him. Then, a little while later, Klaus ended up in the director's office. A person clutched a tiny badge packed with details on Klaus Noldor, this so-called D-class adventurer. It was Mrs. Salazar, the guild's master, standing calm as an elder, sitting quietly, and smiling like she knew everything. She leaned in and told the shrunken Klaus not to fear a thing. He wasn't hauled in just to get scolded. She lifted her mug of tea, leaned in, and said it was the complete opposite. Then she burst into praise for the guy and his flawless work as an adventurer. She even warned that all of this left room for doubt. Then, right after her words, they laid the mandrake on the table and he carried it straight to the guild. She said getting that plant wasn't easy at all, so she started wondering where he could possibly find it then. Right in that instant, Taryn and Miss Salazar both appeared like they'd just been struck. The whole room felt like a pressure cooker. Then Klaus flashed a huge smile and said he'd stumbled on her by accident in the Gorge of Lamentation. Both girls stared at him like he'd just pulled off the impossible, and grins curled at their lips. After a while, Klaus finally burst back onto the street, and with pure joy, he threw his hands up high. He snapped his focus to Liza and swore he'd nailed it, 0 lies, not a single one, and somehow, he even buried the truth about his skills role in it. Klaus realized he probably shouldn't have panicked that hard, but then something else hit him, so he spun back to Liza, replaying in his head just how much he'd pulled in. 1 copper coin buys a loaf of black bread, but 1 gold coin can snag a whole 1,000 loaves, so he finally scraped together 22 gold coins, and he couldn't wait to see his sister light up with joy. Miss Salazar leaned in and said, "Yeah, but that's not everything. We still have 1 mandrake left." And the most it could fetch was around 250 gold. Klaus stared in disbelief at the numbers. When the guildmaster called it the maximum and said the wholesale cost was around 65 coins, he still couldn't wrap his head around it, because even as a full guild, they never handled deals that huge. Miss Salazar leaned in and asked if Klaus would barter like. Could he trade with them? They'd toss him gear that matched the value, or even magic stones. If that were true, he'd have gotten 13 huge teardrop-shaped magic stones, yet the stone lizard only coughed up one, and he still ended up painfully average. Then Klaus grinned and shouted that he could raise his level yet. Somehow, it all just landed like a cruel hit. From the window of her office, Misella watches as Klaus burst out of the guild building with pure joy lighting up his face. She understood nothing zero, and then the woman dropped a bombshell. Up until yesterday, Klaus was considered a total joke, but today he storms in and hands them an S-class ingredient mandrake. She also pointed out he'd even taken down a B-class monster solo, a stone lizard. And then she demanded, "So tell me, is Klaus really just a D-class adventurer?" She whipped around to Terran, who was locked in on every word, and told him they had to keep Klaus under close, careful watch. She warned him he'd only become an indispensable figure, or everything would stay exactly the same as before, and now they had to figure out which one it was. Terran's face snapped serious, and he promised they'd carry it out, then hunt down every single thing they could about him. After a while, up in the mountains, Klaus was back at it, setting up a small piece of equipment again, hard hat locked on, and fiddling with a lantern strapped to his protective helmet. He braced himself to step into the dreaded rundown beginner zone, the Twilight Mines. Klaus yanked his helmet shut and declared his automation had already crushed the vegetation problem, so now he was ready to test it on something new. On level 27, Klaus Noldor strode into the cave, swearing this time he'd haul back minerals, then freeze someone was stalking his every move, a Girl Scout hiding in the shadows. The sky boomed, yelling the name Twilight Copies, and he swore that a full 1,000 years ago, the ancient dwarves had hacked deep tunnels hunting mithril, then the customer demanded magical, shining armor. In every city and in every home, magical shining stones lit the world, mined almost anywhere, so the tiny ones were handed to kids as pocket money. Cluse shot him a look and started to say one thing, then the guy burst out laughing, declared he was done with it, and with a snap of his hand, he yanked open the status window, smugly boasting that he counts on automation for everything. The jeweler cracked open the catalog, and boom, magical shining stones lit up the page, and he was shocked he could instantly pick the big ones. What really hit him was how fast the collection was, meaning those stones were basically right by the entrance. Clouds laughed and said it was a piece of cake. Then he told his sister to hang back, tapped the screen, and hit the button like it was nothing, firing up the 3rd level automation and turning on the auto assembly skill. He burst into another thunderous laugh, shouting that the time had finally arrived to smash the grip and hurl it away, and he was talking about his own mining pickaxe. The Girl Scout just stared at the whole scene in silence, hidden in dark clothes around the cave corner, watching Klaus like a shadow, and yeah, it really bugged her that Klaus kept running his mouth for a guy who was traveling alone. Once the girl slipped away from Klaus busy stuffing his gear, she yanked her hood off, let out a shaky breath, and realized it didn't matter what happened. She still couldn't refuse her sister. She let out a heavy sigh, stunned that she was the one stuck doing it for some low-level adventurer. Tiara, just a mid-level adventurer, spun toward where Klaus had been, and the instant she looked, she realized he was gone. Tiara snapped with shock, her mind screaming, where could he possibly go in that little time, and she immediately lunged forward, yanking her weapon out. Tiara sprinted ahead, confused out of his mind, because just a second ago, he'd been standing right in front of her. Suddenly, thud, something slammed onto the floor, and she spun around fast, only to see tiny stones scattered on the ground, raining down from above. Tiara snapped her head up, and there was Klaus, already standing at the top of the cliff. He was hauling himself up at lightning speed, not even once slowing down to breathe, and she couldn't wrap her mind around how he was even up there right now. She didn't even hesitate. She sprang off the ground and chased Klaus, determined to catch that disappearing bastard before he vanished from her sight. She sprang from one rock to the next, scaling the cliff at insane speed, and Tiara couldn't stand the thought of that guy believing he could take down a mid-level adventurer like her. Right after that, the girl sprinted up the slope where Klaus had just been, and her jaw dropped, because the guy was leaping from one incline to the next like the hills were nothing more than tiny rock. After his next jump, Klaus slammed to a stop on a slope, pickaxe clenched in both hands, while Tiara could only stand there and watch. The girl couldn't believe her eyes. She stood there gasping for air, mouth hanging open as she stared in total shock. While Klaus kept striking pay dirt with magic stones, Tiara couldn't help but stare like, who is this total maniac? Klaus yanked the ore free in a flash, then the car assembly finally ended, and he snapped back to consciousness. The moment Klaus opened his eyes, he stared straight ahead at 20 huge magical stones, stacked neatly and shining like they were alive. Klaus gripped his pickaxe, staring at the glittering, pricey stones right in front of him, and a sly smile crawled onto his face. He couldn't believe his luck. Right in his reach were even the minerals, and he could grab them safely without a single worry. He grabbed a stone in his hand and burst out laughing, claiming no doubt about it that it was one of those 20 huge, magical, shining gems. To finish the job, though, he needed to collect 200 of the same, and as the words left his mouth, doubt crept in. Maybe he was just too naive. But there were tons of them packed in that place. And Klaus blurted that if he dug just a little, he'd hit another stone right away. Then he wondered if he'd stumbled onto a whole hidden hole deposit. Klaus told them that if luck smiled on him, he might even unearth a monster of a stone. Just like he'd hoped, he actually tracked down exactly what he wanted, only this time, the happy guy stood there grinning as he held a massive magical, shining stone in one hand and an even bigger magical, shining stone in the other. But the guy erupted in joy, shouting his sister's name over and over, screaming that he'd actually pulled it off, and today they were probably gearing up for some huge fancy dinner tiara. Watching him, couldn't help but wonder why he was still yelling instead of just working quietly. After a while, Klaus finally pulled it off. He stacked 200 huge stones, grabbed 5 even bigger ones, and ended with one giant magical stone that glowed like it had its own pulse. After a while, Cloud finally jammed every single magical, glowing stone into a big bag. Finally, he dropped the shovel and pickaxe onto the ground, then plopped down on a rock inside and said he'd finished the job in a blink while Klaus just stared, stunned that automatic resource collection could be this insanely good. He grinned as he yanked open the system and started binge scrolling every page, pick up copper, iron, lead, silver, and gold too, and even snag a fusible stone or magical iron for Klaus. It was all there. He tore through the catalog, talking as he went, convinced he could probably pick any mineral he'd ever crossed paths with before. He flipped through the pages below and froze. New minerals had appeared that weren't there just a bit ago, but that didn't mean they were easy to snag. Even the best high-grade stuff took over 100 hours to collect. He let out a heavy sigh and admitted it didn't look like lightning would strike twice this time, especially not like last time when he actually scored a rare mandrake. The moment Klaus said that, his eyes snapped to a rare S-class mineral in the catalog, an eerie ghost shine stone, and he tracked it down in just half an hour. He was totally stunned by what he'd found. This ghostly shining stone can soak up magical power, so wizards are fighting over it like crazy. The dude burst into joyful shouts the moment he found exactly what he needed, yelling that this was another rare material they could mine in just a couple dozen minutes, while Tiara, hiding behind a rock, was terrified out of her mind. She peeked from behind the stone and stared straight at him, and at that moment Klaus couldn't wrap his head around it. This ghostly shining stone shouldn't be here, because these stones get mined only in cemeteries. Klaus snapped out of it and realized this wasn't what mattered right now. He couldn't stop weighing the danger, trying to decide whether to go for the risk or leave everything exactly as it was. That was the burning question. He knew this could turn into a disaster just like the mandrake, because once he wakes up after the skill ends, the most brutal monsters are waiting for him. He knew he was helpless right then, because last time he barely clawed his way back from the edge of death, and only luck saved him. If that lizard hadn't been spooked into running by the mandrake's scream, it would have still been standing there on the ground. But he knew this much back then. His power was way lower than it is today. During the Stone Lizard Showdown, he was only level 11 and now he's already level 27. And yeah, his fencing finally leveled up, so he snagged a new obsidian dagger, the kind that tears through medium level monsters. Because of the 3rd level detection, he could instantly feel dangerous monsters closing in, so he slammed his fist into the screen and snapped that he hadn't fully tested it yet. But he still had a trump card ready, and in a surge, he pushed automation up to level 4. He kept his fist pressed against the screen, wrestling with the thoughts in his head: dive in now or back out before it was too late. Still, he made his choice helmet on, like he could totally handle it, and then he hit the switch on his 3rd level automation to start automatic resource collection. He figured that even if he didn't charge into a low level dungeon, he'd never find a way to pull off an adventure anywhere else. Then Tiara stared at Klaus, eyes wide with disbelief, completely lost about what he was about to do next. That's exactly what Klaus told himself back then, until the day he'd come to regret it. Right then, a sharp warning shout tore through the air, screaming for someone to dodge. In the next breath, something colossal crashed down on the spot. Klaus and Tiara barely dodged it. And then, right before their eyes, a towering skeleton monster stood there, and they could only freeze, staring in terror as dread swallowed them whole. Klaus dropped to the ground, clutching his pickaxe, frozen in terror as the monster stared back, and Tiara gripped her dagger bones scattered everywhere around them. Right after that, the skeleton lunged at them, and straight away, the whole room exploded with desperate screams from terrified adventurers trapped in pure nightmare. About 30 minutes ago, Cloud shot up and unleashed his 3rd automation skill: automatic resource collection, snatching a ghostly, shining stone. The timer sprinted forward, minute after minute flying by until the full half hour was up. Then, just as the stone search window slammed shut, Klaus snapped back to consciousness, blinking as a heavy fog lingered behind his eyes. The instant he snapped back to consciousness, a tiny, perfectly neat stone sat in his palm, and the shock on his face was instant. Because right then, he was clutching a rare S-class item, squeezing that pale ghostlight shining rock like it might vanish. Klaus stared at the ghostly shining S-class stone in his hand, and joy exploded through him. He grinned so wide he almost couldn't breathe, then leaped into the air and yelled the stone's name like it was a trophy, screaming that he'd finally gotten it. While I jumped, something crunched under my feet and my stomach dropped. I suddenly clocked that the whole scene was weird. The guy staring at me with a complicated expression, and I realized I was standing in a strange place. He jerked his head around, then froze, because everywhere he looked, the ground was littered with the broken remains of people. And he lost it, screaming at the top of his lungs, terrified and totally lost in that nightmare. Clue snapped his gaze upward and found the shelves packed wall to wall with human skulls. Not a single book in sight. Klaus staggered forward, convinced he'd just stumbled onto a secret cemetery for ancient dwarfs. He'd heard it rumor by rumor, sometimes an old mind spit one out like a legend. In his grip, he clutched a ghostly, shining stone that blazed so bright it lit the way for him, acting like a lantern the whole time. He clung to the truth that the place wasn't about to explain itself, and only one question burned in his mind now. Where was he, and what kind of nightmare room was this? The walls were pierced, and the whole scene made his nerves snap, especially in a setting so ominous it felt alive. He snatched a pickaxe, flung it over his shoulder, then shot his hand up and tore open the system window, typing like his life depended on it, and there it was on the screen, a timer counting down at 6 hours and 45 minutes. Turns out, Klaus cracked the first automation skill, automatic return, so no matter if he's in the dungeon or out in the field, he can always snap back home on his own, and with that power, his safe return becomes guaranteed. A mouse that could have been just a notch stronger. He'd already spotted a picture of himself in an office, right in front of Miss Alizar, while Terrence stood behind her. Both girls beamed with creepy smiles and grilled him about where he got it, but he couldn't explain a single thing. Because this return kicks in automatically, Klaus has no clue where he's coming from or how he'll make it back. He just pictured the girls' nervous little laughs when he tells them he found it in the Twilight Mines. And once you see what this skill can do, you won't be able to keep quiet. He pushed forward and admitted at least it was only a creepy cemetery, not some underground burial ground that turned into a dungeon. Because if it was, then when he woke up, he'd be surrounded by skeletons and evil spirits. He strode ahead, clutching a ghostly, shining stone, and he flat out said, automation skills make life easy, but the moment you end up in a place like this, you're in real, terrifying danger. Spotting a ledge in the building, Klaus rounded the corner, clutching his stone then. As soon as he stepped into that spot, his ghostly glow caught Tiara instantly, because she stood there gripping a dagger in both hands. The girl stood hemmed in by human skulls, and it only made the nightmare feel tighter than the moment they spotted each other. Both of them shot back in terror, because neither one of them expected to find the other here. Klaus bolted away from the girl and blurted that a ghost must have popped out in front of him. Then he shrieked again, stared hard at Tiara's face, and couldn't make sense of how a girl this beautiful could possibly be chasing ghosts. Tiara felt completely thrown off by Klaus's words then. Out of nowhere, she heard a wheezing sound right behind her, and a shadowy silhouette started to crawl into view. Sensing something was off, Tiara launched at Klaus, screaming for him to get down, and right after, a skeleton-shaped monster burst out of the wall behind them. Tiara and Klaus were sprawled on the floor, and their faces couldn't be more different. Klaus trembled with fear, while Tiara stared down the monster inches from them, hostility blazing in her eyes. Out of nowhere, that monster, no doubt a skeleton, exploded into a bone-rattling scream. And sitting on his skull was a neat little helmet, while a torn raincoat hung raggedly off his bones. When that monster let out its bone-chilling scream, Klaus and Tiara shot back a terrified yell, and this time, nothing but panic stared from their eyes as they realized they were in a truly impossible spot. Tears stung Klaus's eyes as he whirled around, panic blasting through him. He screamed at the top of his lungs and bolted to escape as fast as his legs could carry him. With Tiara at their side, they sprinted flat out. While behind them, a monster crashed forward too, its legs tangled in bandages as it chased them down. Klaus was yelling something you couldn't even make out. Then Tiara fired back. "What are you saying?" And Klaus snapped, "Tell me what kind of massive skeleton is chasing us." Without slowing a step, Tiara yelled that this beast was nothing compared to her because it's a low-level monster, while this skeleton is mid-tier, a skeleton knight. Skeleton Knight is a roaming undead guardian that lurks deep beneath the earth, protecting an underground cemetery, though its power wildly swings depending on what gear it's strapped with. She said this guy had pumped his strength way higher than normal, and with Tiara's skills, she'd struggle to beat him. Klaus thanked her for saving him, then blurted out, "So who are you?" The second that question hit the air, Tiara spun away from Klaus, refusing to answer, and just then the guy finally caught it, something he'd never noticed before. Klaus realized she had bamboo ears shaped like little leaves. Klaus noticed one more thing too, her skin was dark. He figured she was about the same age as his little sister, Liz, and without even thinking, he blurted out whether she was a dark elf. Tiara clenched her fist, shoved it toward him, and spat out her name, then warned him not to label her by race because that was straight up rude, and after that, she let him have it with insults. She kept going and snapped at him not to stare at her like that because it was straight up disgusting. Then she realized he wasn't even looking her way anymore, so she let it drop. The skeleton was right on their heels, and the moment the adventurers rounded that corner, it stared them down with pure icy sternness. Then the creepy monster started snapping its head around, desperately hunting for whoever bolted away so fast. Klaus and Tiara didn't waste a second, they sprinted on, desperate to break free from this crushing, depressing nightmare. Then boom, the monster clocked them, and Tiara snapped, saying the skeleton was still sprinting right behind them when Klaus finally heard it. In a terrified voice, he blurted out, "Why is this happening?" While Klaus fought to break free from the monster, he demanded to know how something this terrifying even managed to track Tiara. Then Tiara shot back, asking how he knew about it in the first place. She wanted to blurt out that she'd been stalking him, but she swallowed it down, then insisted it was all her fault, and claimed she'd been blindsided and attacked out of nowhere while she was at the cemetery. Tiara was about to snap that, even if Klaus said anything, she wouldn't reply, then she froze mid-sentence, like something just hit her. The adventurers barreled into the passage, and it was trashed with rubble from that shattered building. With no way to retreat, all they could do was lock up, stare at the wreckage, and stay silent. The main character snapped that it was a dead end. Then, just moments later, the monster slammed in behind the guys, right on Klaus's tail, sword already raised as it charged in to end him. The skeleton lunged straight for his head, helmet, and all the same tiny piece Klaus had slapped on to dodge injuries while he hunted for minerals. Suddenly, the room exploded with a loud crash. Then Klaus tumbled head over heels across the floor, still rolling as the guy's grip let go of the pickaxe. He finally came to a stop and immediately rubbed his aching head. Klaus realized the hit meant for him was getting blocked. Tiara slammed herself in front of it, fighting through sheer grit, and with her tiny blades, she clamped down on the enemy's gigantic sword. Her hands trembled as she clung on with every last ounce of strength. Then she grunted and blurted out that the monster was insanely strong, asking if it was really just an ordinary level foe. While Klaus spun toward the girl, stopping the monster, Tiara ripped through the silence with a scream, "Run!" at the guy. Tiara's words hit him like a shock. She told him to stop thinking about her and sprint away even faster, because now he finally had his chance. She snapped that Klaus was just a burden, and that he had to bolt out of there right then, rage and helplessness twisting across his face. Because he couldn't do a thing for her, right after those words, he shot to his feet and sprinted for the exit. Klaus didn't even glance at Tiara, still wrestling the monster back as he sprinted ahead with his eyes shut tight, pickaxe gripped in his fist, because in that kind of chaos, there was no other escape. He told everyone he couldn't hand over a thing. He was just a low-level adventurer, and he'd get no help from himself either. Right then, Liz, his beloved sister, flashed across his mind, grinning at him like she always did. Suddenly, he slammed on the brakes and stared like his mind had broken open, complicated, cold, empty-eyed. Then, without warning, he bolted in the opposite direction, while Tiara, still barely alive, struggled to stand, clutching the blades that kept her from dying. Right after Tiara spotted it, Klaus was right behind that monster. The second he saw his chance, Klaus snapped his pickaxe forward and smashed the creature on the helmet as it tried to keep attacking Tiara. A sharp knock rang through the room, and the skeleton's helmet looked battered and warped. Klaus had smashed it into that pickaxe edge to hide it. Then, right after that boom, the air in the room went still, like time froze on the spot. Tiara stayed locked in, blades up, while Klaus was already airborne from his strike. In the next heartbeat, the skeleton's head snapped toward Klaus, and he froze in shock because the monster was seething with rage, and Klaus just launched an attack from behind. With a snap of movement, the skeleton knight pivoted on Klaus's side, blasting Tiara away with a heavy thud, then it slammed Klaus too, flinging him backward. Tiara shot through the air, then keeled over, coughing up blood, and while she was fading, that skeleton monster stared at the clouds and let out nightmare screeches. The girl stared at Klaus with a crushing glare, snapped that he was stupid, then demanded why couldn't he just run away. Sprawled on the ground, Klaus snapped that this would be the worst kind of behavior for him. He couldn't just bolt and leave a girl who looked like his Liz to battle on her own while he ran for his life. Klaus pushed himself up from the floor, pride blazing in his chest, and said he was going home to tell his sister. Then he snapped around to the skeleton and warned it to brace itself. With a sharp flick of his hand, he yanked the system open right into a situation that felt like a blindside punch, because Klaus was already wrecked, maimed, and crippled, and he had no clue what might hit next. It was a seal, one of those brand new automation skills, supercharged with magic stones. But the second he looked at it, he knew the truth. No matter how he tried, it was too dangerous for him. Just as the monster stood behind Klaus, poised to strike, the guy slammed his way into the 4th level of the automation skill, and the fight kicked off on its own. Automation mode. Once the automatic return skill kicks in, it always fires back and straight up brings you home from the dungeon field. The skill's 2nd level autopilots you, yanking you right back to places you've already been. Dungeons, fields, cities, you name it. That 3rd skill level is automatic resource collection. Once you've found a resource at least one time, it'll keep vacuuming it up for you. No limits. And next up, the skill's 4th level kicks in, automatic combat, letting you fight on your own, targeting an opponent you've battled before every single time. After Klaus fed the system every last detail about the opponent, she spun the screen around and told him the fight would take exactly 13 minutes. Klaus checked the clock and wondered if he could even last through all these 13 minutes, because he was already a level 5 adventurer. But this opponent is a mid-level monster and Tiara is shaking so hard she can barely move. The moment she tries to rise, the girl screams at Klaus to run as fast as he can because time is running out fast. The cloaked one grinned through pure heaviness, then snapped the skeleton's name and challenged him to battle. His jaw clamped so hard a crack echoed. He slammed the coveted button and boom, level 4 of the automation skill lit up, unleashing automatic combat. The moment his fingers smacked the activation button, his eyes shut tight and that 13-second timer started sprinting forward like it had something to prove. Right after that, his whole body sank to the ground, slow as a heavy sigh like Klaus had just nodded off where he stood. Tiara stared at the guy slumped on the floor like he was frozen in time, shaking with disbelief because she had no clue what was happening to Klaus. The monster snapped toward him to strike and the guy swung his sword right up close. Just then, Tiara erupted into a scream, yelling, "Are you really asleep?" The monster's blade snapped toward his head and he whipped out of the way at the last second so smooth and fast it was almost impossible to even spot. In the blink of an eye, it was a weird, accidental looking mess. Then the skeleton lunged again and every single move landed just like the first time Kloof dodged fast enough to barely feel the swipe. The monster swung again, this time chopping straight from top to bottom, yet Klaus stayed unshaken, rolling calmly from side to side like it didn't even touch him. Because Klaus kept pushing like that, the monster snapped, rage flared in its chest as it couldn't take down that one guy. Seeing it, Tiara shot out in a gasp and demanded to know why Klaus had even set the monster off in the first place, right as the skeleton started prowling around the square, jabbing for a single hit at Klaus. Yet somehow, Klaus dodged every single strike again. With the monster's crushing pressure pounding the room, a towering cloud of dust shot up, and Tiara panicked, clutching her eyes shut tight. She couldn't stand to watch the guy's fate unfold. She thought he turned into a total human wreck then. Right in that instant, Klaus snapped up from the dust with a sharp jerk. He tapped the ground lightly, then streaked past the monster like a bullet, pickaxe in hand, and slammed it hard into his chest. Tiara couldn't even speak. She couldn't believe Klaus survived. She still couldn't wrap her head around how he managed to enrage that monster, then baited it straight into a massive, large-scale attack. Through all these attacks, she still couldn't read what he was planning with that shovel and pickaxe clenched in his hands. Right then, Klaus slammed the shovel into the dirt, yanked free in one sharp motion, and launched himself forward, jerking hard while he swung that razor-sharp pickaxe. In the blink of an eye, Klaus was behind the monster like it never even saw him coming, and with brutal speed, he swung a pickaxe and drove it into its torso, severely wounding it before it could react. Tiara stared at it all, mouth hanging wide in pure shock, then she dropped to her knees and watched the fight explode right in front of her. Right as the moment hit, the monster's helmet slammed to the floor, metal clanging back and forth like a vicious ringing knock in the room. After that brutal, confident strike, Klaus hit the ground on his feet and the monster just kept standing there behind him, looming in a weird, unsettling silence. Right then, the motionless monster's skull suddenly cracked, didn't fully split, but those sharp fractures raced across the entire surface. Tiara stared at the battlefield, stunned stiff, not a word coming out because she couldn't wrap her head around what Klaus had done to make that skeleton get destroyed like that. Right then, the monster twisted its head back to stare the guy down, radiating pure, explosive rage over how badly it got hit so furious that steam started blasting out of it. The evil monster bolted back, desperate to finally finish the annoying guy, sprawled motionless on the ground after the last hit while the skeleton swung his weapon side to side, rage blazing from deep inside him. The second he closed in, he launched into a brutal assault, swinging his weapon wildly in every direction while Klaus stayed stone calm, calmly slipping past every strike like this was nothing. The skeleton kept slashing without pause, but Klaus juked every enemy attack so fast and clean that the monster couldn't land a single hit. Klaus snapped into a lightning spin so fast his own cloak couldn't even catch up, forget about the monster trying to take him down. Once he finally cranked up to the exact speed he needed, he slammed into the monster with his pickaxe, clanging it into his spine and arms, making him lose grip, drop his sword and shield, and send the whole skeleton reeling like it just got shattered from the inside. Tiara sat on the floor, deadly quiet, staring as the skeleton's slow death unfolded like a nightmare. After the attack, the monster stumbled down hard, and he clamped the shovel through the ground until it bit into the soil, then he stood on the handle like he weighed nothing at all. Stunned by what she'd just seen, Tiara froze and stared at Klaus, speechless, her face flashing with emotions she could barely grasp. Dagger clutched in both hands, she fought to make sense of the impossible thing in front of her. At that exact moment, Klaus, still trapped in the grip of his automatic combat skill, plummeted straight onto a shovel. Tiara stared at him, thinking, what kind of guy is this? And to everyone's shock, the timer hadn't budged. 8 minutes, still sat there. Soon, The guild building erupted with loud shouts, and someone hurried in to straighten out exactly what had just been said. Taryn clung to the reception desk as her pounding feet ripped massive cracks across the floor, and Klaus stared at her in sheer panic, frozen because he didn't know what to say. The girl's eyes went wide. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. Right there in front of her sat a pristine ghost stone, snugly wrapped in a tiny bit of cloth. The girl snapped her glare at the clouds and demanded to know, was there really a ghost stone sitting right in front of her? Her scream tore through the guild like a siren, and every guy inside the building snapped around at once. Klaus Tinsley even told Taryn that her voice was absolutely deafening. The girl tried to blur it out just how huge the stone was, but Klaus clamped his hands over her mouth and shoved his own words back into her. She had a voice that carried too far, and if she kept talking, people would start asking questions. Every wizard snapped their eyes to the two people who went stiff and silent at the reception desk, and disbelief hit them hard like, how could they possibly be talking about something that rare? They even started whispering that it had to be a mistake. The girl kept grinning as she locked eyes with Klaus, daring him with her glare like, do you even know what this thing you brought to this table is worth? Still gripping Taryn's face, Klaus awkwardly burst into a laugh and muttered that he'd somehow messed up again. Taryn just stared at him like, I'm done, and told him to shut it and stay quiet. The girl locked eyes with Klaus, basically begging him to understand what she was about to ask. Klaus awkwardly snapped his gaze away, mumbling that he must know, until one more thing completely shut him down. Klaus shot his eyes away, already bracing for the next round of brutal questions because he loathed it with every fiber of his being. That place was crawling with those terrifying people. Suddenly, the air in the room turned heavy. The door behind Taryn inched open, and from behind her, dread and horror started to crawl out, crushing poor Clouds with fear. Guildmaster Miss Salazar hovered outside the reception door, gripping it tight with her metal hand, quietly taking in every moment while wearing a smile so terrifying it made the whole place feel frozen. Miss Salazar slid her hand out the door and slowly squeezed, then lifted just her index finger and called Klaus Dauer with a simple hand gesture, and the moment she did, every girl at the registration desk turned deathly pale. Mrs. Salazar roared for the clouds to move, and right then, her expression hardened. She stared from head to toe, saw what was happening, and panic hit the clouds so hard they screamed, with all the color draining out of the guy's face. Even with her voice sharp and steady, the guildmaster still barked at Klaus, demanding if he was scared of her. Then Taryn snapped her chin up, shut her eyes with pride, and promised she'd personally escort Klaus straight to the guild director's office, Mrs. Salazar. After a while, the same old picture from before popped up again. Like a curse, Klaus sat with his hands folded on his legs, eyes locked on the floor, too terrified to glance at the table right in front of everyone, where a huge, ghostly, shining stone sat atop the cloth. Miss Salazar's smile turned eerie as she pressed. Where did Klaus get a mineral this rare? Taryn went still, staring at Klaus and the stone, piecing together what was happening. The mouse chuckled nervously, insisting he'd grabbed the stone by pure accident, and Mrs. Salazar snapped with fury, impatiently demanding to know exactly where he'd gotten it, her voice dripping with aggression. Both girls blurted out at once, asking if he'd mined that huge, ghostly glowing stone from the Twilight Mines while he was off digging up other minerals for the job he'd taken. Klaus nodded along and then swore it was all totally accidental, so the girls burst into incredulous laughter, repeating how ridiculous it was that Klaus had even brought up the Twilight Mines, while the guy leaned in and said, honestly, that's wild even for me. The girls kept repeating Klaus's words about how incredible it was, and their voices shook even more with disbelief. Then Miss Salazar sucked in a deep breath, slid out her monocle, and raised it right to her eye. Mrs. Salazar leaned toward Klaus and asked if he had any idea what a stone like that even costs. Then she faltered mid-sentence, changed her words on the spot, and declared that this ghost stone was absolutely enormous. Klaus didn't quite catch what the lady said. Then the guy asked whether that stone was worth about a single gold coin. He immediately started muttering that the ghost stone had to be tied to the Archmage's staff, and the girls nodded right along, confirming everything. Miss Salazar stared down and said those special stones were almost non-existent. So rare, they were barely even like a single little finger, and Klaus just couldn't wrap his head around what she meant. Miss Salazar leaned in and asked Klaus if he'd ever heard an unusual legend, an illustrated tale of a mighty magician who tracked a brave man from a specific country, the one who once stood up and defeated a terrifying evil dragon. Klaus said he heard her clearly, then he went on to insist this tale is the real deal from history, and that the jewel chained to the tip of the great magician's wand is an insanely rare, top-tier treasure. That stone was a ghost stone about the size of a big fist, and right then, Klaus let out this dumb grin because a ghostly, shining rock lay right in front of him, sitting neatly on a strip of cloth. Cloud's nerves snapped into attention. He shot his hand up, then tightened it into a hard fist. All while that smile refused to leave his face inside, thoughts were crashing through his skull, but not a single word would come out. He stared at his own fist, then snapped his eyes to those ghostly shining stones because when he looked back at his hand, it started to tremble and he finally realized that stone matched the size of a big fist perfectly. Right then, Miss Salazar just smiled in silence, eyes cast downward. Then she shook her head at how totally lost Klaus looked, still clenching his fist while he kept turning it over like it was a ghostly, shining stone. Just when the silence started to feel deadly, Mrs. Salazar snapped into the room and barked that the ghostly, shining stone Claudia found and brought to the guild wasn't just any gem. It was the kind of national treasure that you never touch without permission. When that thunderous claim hit the air, Klaus snapped into full panic. He screamed in shock, realizing, too late, what he'd just dragged into the guild. And then it all clicked. That's why the girl was furious. Our Klaus gaped at Mrs. Salazar in stunned silence, and he burst out loudly demanding whether a national level class like that even had a place in their country. The lady claimed that if you turned all of this into gold coins, the retail price alone would net at least 600. Then Cloud just erupted in a loud scream, completely stunned by what he'd heard. Mrs. Salazar grinned and said there were probably thousands, maybe around 2,000 gold coins sitting on the table right in front of them, on top of everything else. And then she pointed out that this ghostly, shining stone can supercharge a magician's magic. Shocked, Klaus couldn't stop shaking as it finally hit him. Then Miss Salazar smirked, shook her head, and told him smugly that this was exactly the reaction she'd been aiming for. From the start, only problem was, she was even more picky than anyone could have guessed. Mrs. Salazar slammed a little tray of a ton of gold coins onto the table and said that if he bought that ghostly, shining stone from the guild, the wholesale cost alone would be 100 gold coins. He stared at that money like it was supernatural, couldn't blink for the life of him, because that saucer was packed with an insane amount. Basically like a gift from the heavens, and he knew right then that 100 gold coins wasn't something small at all. Klaus knew 100 gold pieces was a fortune way more than a mandrake would ever fetch, especially since they only paid 65 in bulk for the batch Dillis. He stared at the money like a predator, already imagining a life where he wouldn't have to work for years. Right then, Mrs. Salazar leaned in and asked if Klaus wanted to grab some magic stones with this money, so Terran slid a tiny box in front of him, packed with 5 massive magic stones that each cost 100 gold coins. Klaus stared in awe at the stone sitting right in front of him, while Terran stood there holding the box out, calm as ever, waiting for his choice because these stones were worth the money right on the other side. With a weight crushing his soul, Klaus lifted his hand to finally make the call on this brutal decision while Miss Salazar prowled the moment, grilling him for what he should do next. Crushing every last ounce of greed and luxury fueled hunger. Klaus strained as he twisted his index finger toward the massive magic stones that could help him get stronger. Ms. Salazar flashed a knowing smile and said, with total confidence, that Klaus was stubbornly pushing his way to the top. Then she asked if that was what was happening, and when he agreed, she declared it was absolutely excellent. Tehran never once glanced at Klaus, but she sized him up and said, because you bought those magic stones, you'll be crafting your own too, and you'll be a huge help to this incredible guild. The guildmaster warned that if Klaus hogs too much magic from these stones in too little time, an explosion is all but guaranteed, so he needs to stay careful. By then, night had swallowed the sky and the streetlights blazed on soon enough. Mrs. Salazar and Terran shoved Klaus out the door so he could finally head home still stunned. He trudged back like he couldn't believe any of it, because the whole thing still didn't make sense to him. The girls pressed Klaus, asking if that guy was really flying solo in this whole adventure. Then he nodded and admitted he never could have taken down a monster that strong by himself, insisting it all happened purely by accident. The Cloud said he'd never be standing there if a middle-ranked adventurer hadn't stepped in. Then Terran froze. Miss Salazar grinned and asked how she ended up there. By accident, so what happened to her? Suddenly, Klaus's memory snapped into place. His timer was screaming down because he had just 9 seconds left, and that guy had already ducked behind a pile of bones after a fast jerk and a tiny dagger jab straight into the monster's skull. With one brutal strike to the monster's head, the skull cracked open and the dagger drove straight into a tiny lump hidden inside that dangerous middle-class beast. With only 6 seconds left on the clock, Klaus froze in place until a massive blast erupted behind him, ripping straight out of the monster's skull, and the shock itself looked like a skull carved into the air. With just 1 second left on the timer, Klaus stood in the fading dust cloud left behind by the explosion then. As the clock hit 0, he slowly opened his eyes and stared at the floor in dead silence. Out of nowhere, brutal pain detonated across the guy's entire body. He winced, gagged, and coughed up blood like it was tearing out of him, then crumpled to the ground and screamed at the top of his lungs. Klaus writhed on the floor, desperate to stop the pain and praying at least one full bone was still standing in his body, while Tiara strolled up to the helpless guy with slow, steady confidence. The girl shoved a mystery wand into the poor kid's mouth, and when the guy demanded answers, he guessed she dumped some low-grade potion on him. Then he pressed Tiara, asking what she had besides those drugs. Tiara didn't even flinch. She slid the guy a bottle just bigger than her hand, then shot him a question. Did he really choose to die right here, like this? The main character wasted no time. He gulped down what was in that bottle, and the medicine sank in so fast that shock hit him hard as his recovery raced ahead. He blurted, "How did you heal so fast?" Klaus shot back, "Did you slip him some fancy potion?" He replied, "Yeah, something like that would cost around 1 gold coin." Tiara leaned in and said, "Adventurers, seriously take better care of yourselves." He awkwardly downed the liquid like it was burning his throat, then admitted he had no clue what it was because, of course, he's just another low-level adventurer with barely any skills, and after that, he went quiet, gripping the medicine and drinking it without a word. Klaus suddenly snapped, remembered something, and peppered Tiara with one question. Did the girl really have average abilities? The girl puffed up proudly and nodded, then added, with a grin, that you could already call her a veteran. Kluk spun toward the girl, squinted like he didn't buy it, and asked what the veteran could possibly have forgotten in a dungeon like this, especially since they were in a beginner zone, the kind nobody really ever shows up in. Right then, Tiara snapped back to reality. This wasn't a casual hangout. It was a recon mission. She cursed out loud, and the guys just stared, totally thrown. I completely forgot I was supposed to meet someone here. Stunned, Klaus blurted out what kind of meeting could possibly be set up in a place like this, but the girl bolted right away, insisting she had to go while he fought to get his words out, and Tiara only said, "You can thank me later." Right now, in Miss Alazar's office, the guildmaster and Taryn were on edge, holding their breath as they waited for the person in the room who'd been silenced. In the next breath, Tiara dropped to the ground and bowed her head. Taryn only stared at her with one eye while Mrs. Salazar smiled and asked, like it was the best question in the world, if Tiara wanted to say anything. Tiara shot a guilty glance at the floor, and Mrs. Salazar didn't even look up as she told her they were counting on the elf, so Tiara's chest tightened, and she blurted out an apology for what she'd done during that reconnaissance mission. She stared at the floor and snapped that there was no excuse for her, but then she admitted the guy was acting weird as hell and watching her like something was off then. Right in the middle of the mission, that terrifying skeleton burst into view. Mrs. Salazar stared out the window as the guildmaster snapped that, if the situation was like this, Tiara had to tell her what she should have done when that thing finally noticed her, so Tiara blurted out a loud, guilty apology all over again. The guildmaster said that, no matter what, things somehow worked out for the best. Then she added that Tiara's help saved Klaus's life, and hearing that, Tiara couldn't help but feel a little awkward. Mrs. Salazar said this time she'd look the other way, but next time Tiara wouldn't dodge the fallout because a stunt like that on a mission carries real consequences. After Miss Salazar tore into the girl, Tiara lifted her eyes and stared at the master of her guild, worry flooding her face. Realizing that, Miss Salazar pressed, "Is there anything you haven't told us yet?" And Tiara awkwardly dragged herself around to the guildmaster, admitting the truth that the whole story didn't unfold the way they pictured it. Tiara stared at the floor and admitted she hadn't beaten that skeleton, and in the next second, the whole room went dead silent. Miss Salazar, eyes sharp and expression stone cold, finally snapped her gaze to the girl and said she just couldn't wrap her head around what that mid-level adventurer had been saying. The guildmaster pressed Tiara, asking if she was the one who actually landed the main damage on the monster. Then low-level adventurer Klaus stepped in and finished it. Tiara snapped her eyes shut and insisted, "No, it wasn't like that." She snapped her gaze away and winced hard. Then Tiara scrambled for the words, insisting she really did want to help Klaus, and even she couldn't believe what came out next. The girl replayed the day's chaos in her mind, the battlefield, Klaus gripping that pickaxe like a weapon, while the monster lunged at him from right behind. And Klaus thrust his hand toward the skeleton, straight up baiting the monster, and started waving him over, like he was calling a storm to come closer. The moment the skeleton lunged at him with that monstrous greatsword, Klaus snapped out of the way with razor-sharp precision. After that brutally invasive move, Klaus yanked the shovel off his own leg, hoisted it up with his foot, and slammed it straight into the monster's head. Then he swung that same shovel again slam, and this time he drove it upward from the bottom, launching the blow straight through him. After that weird streak of attacks, Klaus slammed a pickaxe into the monster's head and drove it through its spine right at the neck. Right after that, he yanked the pickaxe to a new spot and crashed in another hit with a dagger. In the next heartbeat, he slammed the dagger all the way in, with the shovel finishing off the monster for good. Tiara said that in the end, Klaus still managed to take down the monster all by himself, while the girl just stood there stunned because he'd already handled it. Miss Salazar stared at the girl like she'd just seen a ghost, then snapped her gaze away from the window. She blurted out that she was sorry because she truly believed Tiara. Then the elf came barreling forward, shouting that it was the truth and that she wasn't lying. She couldn't explain the exact moment it happened, but he definitely did it himself. Right then, Taryn was busy talking to the secretary. Miss Salazar fired a question. Did Tiara really claim Klaus wiped out a mid-level monster all by himself? Tiara snapped back. Yeah, back then, it's true. And as he stared at some documents, shock hit him like a punch. The girl snapped her head toward the guildmaster and insisted none of it was right. Everything felt off, 100%. And then, At the worst moment, every eye in the room snapped onto Tareen. The girl snapped that she'd now grabbed a list of every item Klaus brought, and if the numbers check out, then the monster he'd just beaten was the skeleton general. Hearing that, Taryn's face tightened with worry. So she basically told her the monster Klaus cut down was no joke, top tier, and even Tiara couldn't take him out solo, not even with a low-level tag-along. Startled, Miss Alazar asked if that meant the monster really had been beaten after all by that low-level adventurer Klaus Noldor, because honestly, they had no clue who he even was. At the same time, this cheerful guy was ripping around the market with a grin, because finally, he'd get to sink his teeth into some real good meat. So he marched up to the seller and demanded the best he had, and the seller just shrugged and told him, "Sorry, this is a fish shop." Right there at Portiera, Miss Salazar and Terrence stood face to face with her, demanding she explain everything that happened in the dungeon, only for her to blurt, "I don't even know," before they snapped her name back at her. On a certain month and day, the work diary was filled with Terran's notes about Klaus Noldal, a collector tied to a specific guild. In a fog-choked forest arena made for beginners, they were supposed to fight monsters, but because they were low rank, they had to grab a few key items first. The drop report said what spilled out was wild 224 ordinary goblin ears, 23 ears from goblin leaders, 5 more leader ears, and even 1 hobgoblin ear. And in that same place, you had to hunt down 389 ordinary kobold's fangs, plus 22 fangs from the kobold soldiers, and 7 more from the beast kobolds. Green slime nuclear fragments, no kidding, scattered in 21 pieces, and Trent's own little shoots counted for 1 more, while every scrap of monster loot was hunted down and collected too. Old daggers and hatchets clung to goblins and kobolds. Short spears lurked in their hands, and battered clubs swung around until a rough club finally dropped out of the boss's grip. Shields clashed as magic tiny stones rained down, red, blue, green, yellow, and even rainbow stones. When Klaus showed up and unloaded it all in one go, the guild workers stared in disbelief at how he managed to haul that mountain of stuff by himself, yet still, they snapped at him. The girl who made the inventory was stunned too. She fought to keep smiling, but her broken hand shook as her emotions spilled over. Once Klaus handed over every last piece of cargo, the payoff hit hard: 26 Lottie coins, 130 silver, and 70 bronze in return. The kind of cash that made the whole world feel a little safer. Klaus threw his head back and scratched it, grinning so hard you could feel the relief, man. He was thrilled he'd managed to level up this much, and he made sure nobody could tell it was mostly thanks to pure skill. That reaction stunned the guild staff, because they'd been grinding for days to pull out all those resources, and the girls clamped down on their own panic, fighting to keep hysteria from spilling out. The class already told everyone that just a couple of days after he woke up, his automation skill, his whole routine got flipped upside down, and the girl at the counter, spotting him again, said, "You're back, and you sure bring a ton of goods." The girl stared at the chaos of objects and, before it all spilled, she turned to the young man and asked straight up if he really thought he could carry everything by himself without it getting too hard. Klaus, grinning from ear to ear, flashed the girl a thumbs up, then leaned in with a big smile and told her it was totally effortless because everything was absolutely fine. The girls behind burst into screams, tears spilling down their faces. This guy had just doubled their workload again, and now they were stuck grinding day and night. Klaus kept playing the total hopeless fool, like he couldn't get a single thing straight, and all he did was grin at the people who had already blasted him for that service. The drop list was insane: 253 goblin parts, 418 kobolds, 21 slimes, and 1 Trent, plus 178 gear pieces, and 164 magic stone. The girls felt like all of this was ripping value away from their hard work, but they finally got it. They couldn't stop him from killing monsters because they had no right to. Klaus hurled his coin pouch over his shoulder, spun around with that confident swagger, and strode straight toward the exit because that guy still had a mountain of work waiting for him today. Klaus grinned and thought, "Once I mastered it and figured out how it worked, this is insanely easy." The skill practically did everything on its own for him. But he also decided, no, run it back again. What happened in the last battle when the automation skill kicked in, he needed to make it happen all over. But the danger still felt way too massive. Klaus only managed to take down one of those top tier monsters last time. So now the real nightmare hits. What if this round brings a whole swarm with several enemies at once, or even brand new types of foes? Klaus had no choice. He had to double check everything. And just like that, he found himself back in the misty forest where beginner adventurers were walking straight into trouble. Back then, Klaus Noldor, the adventurer everybody knew, was sitting at level 38. And right in that moment, a confident guy shot up, hands on his hips, grinning like he'd finally made it. This was the perfect spot to check in. The 4th automation level was automatic combat, so even if the guy couldn't handle it, there was no real danger waiting for him here because he knew this place like the back of his hand. Right now, there's nobody in front of him, just some dude standing alone in the middle of the forest, and the moment he decided to pop his skill, the timer that controlled it started ticking down. And just like that, The outcome was downright breathtaking. Klaus stood tall with his weapon raised, surrounded by a chaotic pile of defeated enemies from every race and class imaginable. That very day, every last monster from the Misty Forest got wiped out wherever they were hiding because the skill was hunting down everyone at once, leaving them zero chance to slip away. Klaus couldn't believe it, no scratch on him at all. He shut his eyes, opened them, and still couldn't process how his strength would come back, but trouble was already coming. The monsters were about to be reborn, and they'd flood the forest again. But the main character kept lingering in the Misty Forest. This was his 10th time using the same technique, and every single time it tore through everything, killing everyone in its path. Klaus realized his automatic combat power was even crazier than he expected. Now he could slice through anyone weaker than him in an instant, and even take on guys stronger than that. Klaus shut his eyes and bowed his head, admitting the cooldown still lingered, and the worst part was, he still couldn't pick a target to strike, even though, yeah, every technique has its limits. Cooldown, or skill recharge, is the clock you can't skip. It's how long it takes to fully recover, and only then can you unleash that ability again. Klaus scanned the battlefield and realized he couldn't keep that power running forever, but losing the always on didn't make him any weaker. But still, Klaus gets one last heartbeat to breathe, because right before he can unleash a single technique, his skills get locked and frozen. So even if some guy flips on an automatic resource collector, once an enemy shows up, that bot still has to trigger an automatic interception. After that, Klaus snapped back like, no, I can't do this. Sure, he could tap the function he called make legs, but it's chained down by one brutal catch cooldown time. And here's the real downside, you can't set a goal for yourself. From what he can remember, once you hit the automatic combat mode, you might run straight into enemies you already beat before. Or you might bump into someone you've never even laid eyes on. Like that time the general of the skeleton army showed up right in front of him and somehow you already knew how it would end. To get this automatic combat technique to work, you just have to land at least one hit and it'll deal a little damage, even if it's only a small taste. The guy already knew if he could pull this off, he'd lock in the one thing that truly makes it a trump card, and that's exactly how Klaus will claw his way to the very top of the world. By the time the night was fully grown, he'd already swept up every last bit of those massive resources and handed them out. Then he finally started making his slow, guilty way back home, coins clinking as he stuffed his pockets. Cautiously swinging the door open, the guy spun toward his sister, who was already stepping past the threshold, because he blurted that he'd been so wrapped up in testing his skills that he'd totally lost track of time. He also said the bags were so heavy they pinned the young man in place, and after he checked with her sister whether she'd eaten yet, a ladle came flying at Klaus. Klaus didn't even get to finish a single word before he blurted out an apology saying he was already here. Then that thing slammed his forehead and bounced right back into Lisa's hands. The guy even had a fresh scrape on his forehead. Monsters weren't letting him have an easy day. Lisa stepped onto the threshold, waved her hand, and told him, "It's too late today." Rage boiled in Lisa's veins. She looked like she might explode, even though the girl was only 15 and she kept pressing for answers, insisting that Klaus had promised to show up early today. The girl jutted the ladle at him again, and Klaus started to shut himself off. Then she snapped that he'd be stuck eating cold soup as punishment. The young man roared back that he'd finally explained everything. Liz kept firing off the named brother's words like, "He's getting carried away again." And when he finally stepped out into the yard, he realized the sky had already turned night. A girl just shrugged and said, "Yeah, he always does that." When Klaus asked Liz how she knew everything, the girl just smiled and said she understood the young man because, yeah, he's thrilled his new skill is finally growing, but he has to stay on guard or he'll end up seriously injured again. The clowns went wide-eyed when the girl blurted out that his battle with the skeleton general was real, then he got saved in the blink of an eye by a healing potion. Then Klaus convinced himself that Tiela's powerful potion would make it all disappear, but the wounds were still fresh. And when Liz found out, she chewed him out relentlessly. Klaus dipped his head and gave a shy smile, thinking, yeah, my little sister has always been like this, because she worried over him more than anyone else. He kept tossing out excuses and blurting out apologies, and the guy scratched his head and insisted he hadn't done a single dangerous thing today. Then he swore he was ready to answer every one of her questions. Liz cut in, saying the only way he could make up for it was with gifts. Then the girl shot back that if he wanted a kitchen set, the one from Mithro would be the special one. Klaus suddenly remembered this was the exact set the girl had spotted in the city in absolute fortune, costing 12 zloty coins, and when a girl smiled at the fact he actually remembered her, you could feel it click. But Klaus said he could buy it, sure, of course, and then Liz burst out laughing at the idea that they were literally cooking a dragon in it. The girl shot back that it was downright stupid, and somehow that's exactly what rich people do. The girl started to spin around, gripping her wooden weapon tight, and told him she wouldn't cook up a dragon in this set, she'd clo him. Liz let out a nasty laugh, then told her brother this the next time he came back wounded, she'd be waiting armed with a mithril lady. The clout shot his hand out, clenched his teeth, and admitted it hurt like hell, but he insisted she still wouldn't forgive him, not even if his brother sobbed and begged, because he never should have been hurting himself like that during outings. Then the girl snapped around and demanded, "So, Klaus, do you accept these terms?" She swore it was the promise he had to keep, and if he dared break it, he'd straight up die. Klaus lifted both hands, bowed his head in silence, and gave a grin that screamed submission. Then the guy vowed he wouldn't push himself past his limit. He swore that no matter what tried to stop him, he'd always come back home to his sweet, beloved sister, and the moment those words hit, the girl snapped to attention and started turning around. Klaus pushed himself up, brushed the dust off his clothes, and the guy finally got it. His sister was right, and pushing it any further was a bad idea. Then Klaus said he was going to the bathroom. But the guy just couldn't leave it there. Klaus grinned like crazy, thinking it didn't mean he had to make his sister cross. Then the guy spun back to his sister, snapped her name like it was sacred again, and told her her brother was begging for the soup to be warm loud enough for her to gasp, "Got it," and she'd heat it up while Klaus was stuck in the bathroom. As soon as they slid into their seats at the table, he started bragging like crazy, saying he'd raked in 27 gold coins just today. Liz shrugged and said, "That's awesome." Klaus understood the message loud and clear. He'd better bring his A game, because he and his sister wouldn't have to want for anything. And somehow, Klaus managed to snag one more thing. Then the next day, that guy burst into the street and was already slumped against a cart being hauled by an animal. The main character just stood there, waiting for Liz to step out onto the street so she could brag right away. Then she finally appeared, clutching a tiny bundle in her hands, grinning like she'd just won. And he was left totally baffled, wondering where Klaus even got it. Liz grabbed her brother's attention and asked what it was. Then she shoved the bento into his hands, and Klaus practically shouted that it was the brand new cargo donkey the guy had managed to borrow from the guild. The girl leaned into the guy and glanced past him, where the donkey still stood there. She told him she got it about the cart, then snapped. "So what? Did you decide to turn traitor?" Tao shot back. "No, it's for traveling." The plow even bragged that he'd come up with it all by himself. Then the guy pushed things further, but that didn't mean he had to hurt Liz and make her cry. The main character lifted his chin and said they'd follow the old school game plan, find friends, and stick with them. The girl's eyes lit up, and she promised that with friends, even the impossible would turn real. He said if you followed the example, you'd have an easier time fighting the enemy, and you could even split the work to get it done faster, so he'd be home sooner and Liz wouldn't chew him out. And the travel radius stretches even farther. Klaus said he's a total loner, and this plan just doesn't fit him, so Liz snapped, covering her mouth, "Stop," even as she fought not to break down in the morning. That's why the guy hired a loaded donkey. Now he'll finally pay up, most of his worries will vanish, and he'll have the kind of companion he needs. Then the guy started hopping onto the cart like he was on a mission, yelling that today he'd claimed 3 places, and Liz was totally stunned, like she couldn't even process what she was hearing. The boy dropped to the saddle, kicked his donkey into a sprint, and screamed for it to bolt to the closest open field where nobody bothered them. Then he'd take it down with him, and yeah, he was thrilled, because this genius plan felt like it was going to work. Liz stayed put and yelled after her brother that 3 places was way too many. She even knew it herself, but her words got swallowed up and he pushed his donkey forward anyway. While the guild workers slumped behind the counter, something felt seriously off because this weird stranger had just shown up on the horizon. One of the girls flashed a shaky smile and spun to the other, asking, "Did Klaus really snag everything, every single quest we had?" Senpai confirmed it. Klaus snagged only the Misty Forest quest yesterday, but today he went all in and bought the Poisonous Swamp, the Evening Mine, and the Valley of Sorrow. The first girl spun around with wild eyes and snapped that he couldn't possibly clear all of that in a single day, because normally that many quests takes a whole crew, not one person doing it in 24 hours. Someone leaned in and barked out a laugh, saying the guy had rented a donkey just for today. Then the second girl beside him shook as she whispered, her voice trembling, that he'd burned through everything in just a few hours. Taryn just grinned and said the others were overthinking it, and the girl chimed in that this guy is seriously weird because there's no way you could handle that many. One dark-haired girl told them the guy has been pulling off real miracles lately, and Taryn snapped that if he can turn the impossible into something real this time, they'll take another look. Then Terrence's grin turned downright vicious, and he promised they'd make him move no matter how much trouble it brought the guy. One of the girls suddenly yelled, "The cash register." Right then, an adventurer in a pink hooded cape stood there, watching the girl talk about Klaus, and panic hit her hard. She barely processed the words she'd just heard. Then she spun a little, gripped her weapon, and asked in a low voice whether Klaus was truly the lone wolf everyone said he was. The guild was roaring with life like it always did, and half the city somehow crammed into the bar dining room. Then the word hit the streets. Rumors about Clouds were starting to spread fast. The 3 men were bickering because that brat managed to rile Taryn up again, and one of them snapped, Indignant, no one was allowed to disrespect his Terran while the other two only laughed, bringing up how that girl had somehow pulled off the exact same thing. The girl in the pink hood was posted at a table too, munching a fresh salad with rice she'd ordered while her mind drifted straight into the clouds. She kept insisting that the moment people started calling that guy Klaus the loner in the guild, this young nobody then blasted his way into fame because he was already a seasoned adventurer, even if he was stuck at the lowest rank. Soon, the girl snapped her foot and spun toward the men at the next table, firing back that their conversation was way too interesting for them to be oblivious to, because men didn't get to ignore being treated like this. One of the big men barked at the traveler, demanding to know what he wanted in the rudest voice imaginable. Then the girl shot up, snapped her fingers, and told the bartender to give her the exact same drink the men were ordering. Then she rose, shoved her staff against the table, and the whole knock started creeping toward the neighbors where she sat, so the girl demanded, "Tell me what happened. I want every detail." Just like Klaus, she was an adventurer with a lower rank, but when she grinned, she wasted no time and walked right up to the new crew, introducing herself as Maureen and pushing her way into the conversation because she wanted to learn everything they were talking about. Maureen definitely didn't feel like she belonged here, because she singled out Klaus like he was the hometown legend. Then the bearded man burst into laughter after a brief pause. Then he swung one leg over the other, snatched a mug from the table, and asked the girl if she truly wanted to hear this strange guy because Mary couldn't believe that people here actually labeled him that way. While the guild was buzzing with conversation, our main character was already posted at a tiny crossroads right where tourist carriages pulled in and out. The guide swung off the mount and strode to the board where fresh ads popped up now and then, right alongside a map that showed exactly where everything was. Klaus grinned the moment he spotted one of the tour wagons, and the main character instantly thought, "Yeah, this is exactly the kind of help a brand new adventurer needs. Super convenient." It might even help to roam the nearby hunting grounds and cut down the time and hassle, but Klaus knew today wasn't going to play out that way because he had his own transport. Klaus spun toward the cargo donkey he'd be using today and lit up because the guy promised he'd trust the animal. Then he leaned in and urged the donkey to do its job and roll smoothly. That rented donkey was named Hanako, and after the main character begged him, he just stayed planted at the bus stop, sipping water like nothing could stop him. Then he threw his muzzle back and cracked up with a roaring laugh. Right after that, the donkey whipped around to the main character, snapped his teeth forward like he was trying to show them off. Maybe it looked like a grin, but there's no way he understood the Klaus. And while all this was happening, someone crouched behind a tree, watching in silence. The dark elf Tiela knew the scene all too well, spying from the shadows until the girl snapped, furious, convinced the guy was just standing there talking to himself. She spun around, braced herself against a tree, and cursed how none of this felt deserved, starting way back that morning. Then she couldn't even wrap her head around the ass part, because the guy had only just been bragging about productivity. The girl figured that even a horse would blitz a donkey by miles because a runner's speed lands roughly where a donkey's hauling cart pace ends up. Tiela let out a sigh, then realized the guy picked the donkey just for the price, so yeah, that's why she couldn't stand adventurers who were always chasing bargains. Tiela froze in shock when the main character whirled toward the donkey and Shal, yelling for Hanako to kick on the automatic movement function. While the guy climbed onto the cart, he yanked up a whip and started cracking it, driving that donkey forward as fast as he could. Meanwhile, Klaus's first move was to head straight for the poisonous swamps. The donkey bolted like it had rocket fuel, vanishing in a blur and leaving everything in its wake, while Klaus stayed planted on the spot, gripping the reins for dear life and praying he wouldn't pitch right off the cart. Tiela burst out from behind the tree, frozen in total shock because the cart with Hanako's donkey and clowns was already at the very top of that far hill, and she still couldn't even make sense of what just happened. Realizing the dark elf was way back, she tore into a sprint and screamed into the void, begging to be waited for. The girl rode up to the first marker and saw the warning poisonous swamp ahead. No doubt about it, and she still had a 2.5-hour ride on horseback, with good weather waiting for her. While Tiela kept staring at whatever wild, never-before-seen donkey speed Klaus's buddy was showing, the man was already stuck on an automatic movement timer. The timer kept shrinking towards 0, and the main character just sat there with his eyes shut, counting down, waiting for the automatic movement to finally stop. He slowly cracked his eyes open, and there it was. He'd finally stumbled into the poisonous swamps, where a skull-painted sign sat right ahead, screaming that death was close. Then the road kept crawling forward for a few more meters right into the middle of the marshes, while Cloud rose again and scanned the whole scene, staring at the craters of this wildly amazing place. Grind snapped his eyes shut, and when he opened them again, he was already standing where he needed to be. Ahead, a sign blared a poison zone warning. He'd better carry several antidotes, or he'd be done for. That message wasn't random either. A tiny guide had pointed it out. Looking down, he clocked the shadow cast by the sun below, and still, Klaus couldn't make sense of a thing, not even close. He needed exactly 1 hour and 20 minutes. Cloud grinned to himself, still riding the wave of pride he couldn't even believe he pulled it off. using transport with that level of skill. And of course, it all worked. He reached the destination fast, like the new brilliant idea cooked up this morning had magic in it, because with the automatic function, the movement speed was insanely high. The moment he got back from the misty forest, it hit him after all that. Walking to the city ate up a full hour, but with automatic return, he reached it in just 35 minutes. Kluk still remembered that time he sparred with the Royal Knights, so now I wanted to test who was faster, his automatic power or that guy's loud, flashy attitude. The main character would always chuckle warmly, grinning that he was thrilled to face trials like this because no matter what, the race would end the same way. The winner was nearly 15 minutes ahead of his opponent and tore off the starting line first. Klaus still grins when he recalls his very first race he won by more than 15 minutes, and even at that age, he somehow still made it back home safe. But it all smelled like a scam, because that's exactly what the knights shouted at him right after they crossed the starting line, all sweaty and wiped out. That same night, the main character got a sharp lesson. The boy couldn't mix up courage with reckless stupidity. Then he chuckled and said, "A human is just a creature that runs on its feet." In a panic, he fought to flee the night, screaming that he was just a two-legged nobody, and if there was a contest for regular people, he knew he'd win it without question. Then Klaus realized he'd gone too far because suddenly he felt like he was sprinting across rooftops, and the match got scrapped when the opponent claimed he was sick and wouldn't rematch, saying he had no strength left for anything. Even if he felt sick, one truth didn't budge. Klaus had won. The guy sat on the top rank, and there was no way any knight could be weaker than him. The main character clenched both fists and swore it with total certainty. Right then, it was only moving. But once you paired it with transport, the speed shot up. After that, Klaus mulled it over and decided he wouldn't just drive, he'd use a donkey too, because it could cut the time in half, and hey, he'd never once had a mishap with his own skill. The biggest thing on his mind is this: he trusts himself, and that belief isn't something you borrow, it's something you're born with. So even if you're just learning the technique, you'd better act like it's only yours. Klaus kept that huge smile on his face and admitted he still didn't fully get everything yet, because deep down, he was panicking that he hadn't mastered every detail and nuance of the technique. In the end, the main character figured it out. Take the leap, and that's how knowledge and success are earned. Then he tied a blindfold on the donkey and it kept screaming like it knew disaster was coming. Tiela raced up to them and froze when she saw Klaus fiddling with his donkey's eye patch, because the way they handled the travel was nothing like she'd ever seen. The girl crouched to the ground, spotted the path, and snapped that her first hunch was right. Then the main character lunged for a shortcut since the tracks led straight there. But everything felt totally off because in that swamp, there were hardly any shortcuts at all. And the moment she spotted this one, the girl snapped at Klaus as a fool. So what did he pick in the end? The girl spotted a wooden ladder up ahead and swore the guy was about to climb it, balancing a cart on a tree like it was nothing because the tracks were staring right there. And the way he did it still didn't make any sense. As Klaus pushed deeper into the poisonous swamps, word about him kept spreading through the guild. Morim, practically obsessed with men, started digging up every detail about the guy. The girl wasted no time and demanded to know what was so strange about him because she had to understand it. At the same time, Mariam was itching to find out whether Klaus, the loner, was truly as dangerous as people said. The bearded man snatched his mug off the table again, laughed, and told me back when his memory was still clean about an incident that happened a few years ago. The man said that Klaus finally showed what he could do when he went toe-to-toe with one of the royal knights in Bara, and when the girl pressed him for details again, he cut it off fast, said it was only a test. After that, the bearded man casually tossed out that he'd already won, and by a brutal margin of 15 minutes to top it off. So when the boy still crushed it against an actually well-prepared opponent, it made the whole victory feel impossibly weird. And the shortcut he took looked calm and effortless, so the girl guessed he'd cut through, but the man snapped that Klaus had already crossed the aqueduct in the northern part of the city and still ended up making a huge detour. Merim couldn't wrap her head around it. The guy had simply leapt off that bridge and dropped straight down. No hesitation, she swore that height was completely unsafe, but he insisted the boy truly jumped. No doubt about it. Right after the big adventurer declared, "The most exciting part starts now," he just so happened to be there by pure accident, and that's when he spotted something. He swore there was this disgusting pile of garbage down by the bridge, yeah. The guy even used it as a pillow, yet right next to it, a crumbling wall blocked the path. Then the boy sprang down, flipped midair, and shot through that skinny window. He hit the board from above like a springboard and drove forward. Morim demanded answers again, stunned, and the man just shrugged, saying that even he, who'd witnessed it all with his own eyes, still couldn't make sense of it. The truth was, the window Clue dove through from above was barely big enough for one man, and it was so tight and cramped it felt impossible. He fired off a wild calculation with zero hesitation. No doubts, just a full-on jump. Then, when the man cleared the last one, he blurted out that he'd never seen people this strange in his life. Maureen didn't say a word, she just rose from her seat. Then the girl dug into her purse, tossed something that went clink clink on the table, and it was 2 gold coins. With a grateful grin for the beer and his little tip, he leaned in and warned her, "Stay away. Don't let yourself get too close." Maureen shot me a grateful look and told me it was seriously helpful to hear all of it. The girl started to drift away, tugging her cloak tighter as she went, then flashed a smile and murmured that she had business with Klaus, leaving him staring after her, completely lost. The guy who just spun that tale leaned in and asked Maureen if she'd really show up to meet him. She said yes, then he told her the payment for the info was due right now. The girl snapped around on the revelers and yelled that she had no idea what he was even talking about. And the adventurers immediately remembered her promise to refill their drinks, so they snatched the chance and took her up on it. Right then, near the poisonous swamp, Klaus started cracking into everything he'd hauled in from this place. Tyrella finally hauled herself up to him, and when she saw what he was doing, she froze, still hiding, still silent, mouth hanging open in shock, eyes wide like they might pop right out of her head. Every inch of the carriage Klaus wrote in was blanketed in papers he snatched straight from the guild quest after quest for this very place, the same town he's calling home right now. Klaus stood over a tiny scrap of cloth, spreading it beneath everything they'd gathered at just 18. He'd already shot up to level 41, and this job yanked a few more levels right out of the sky into him. On the task list, they ordered him to wipe out frogs and slugs, grab 10 pieces of caustic, burning water, and pour it into 5 bottles. So Klaus stood tall, announced he'd collected everything, and just like that, the quest was finished. He piled everything onto his cart, grinning because it all fit perfectly then. While he bragged that the thing was super compact, he hummed a song to himself like he owned the whole street. Right nearby, Tiela stared. Horrified, this guy moved with terrifying speed and skill. Her hand hovered near her chest as she replayed it in her mind, desperate to know what it felt like in that moment. She stared at the loading screen and went, "Wait, why is this so messed up?" Because this is the first time she's ever seen it. Then his voice snapped in, furious and arguing that she'd only been an hour late and she couldn't wrap her head around it. How did he pull off this whole quest in just 30 minutes? Tiela kept boiling with rage, her instincts screaming that something was off with this guy, because at this pace she'd tail him all day and still never figure out how he pulled it off. If this keeps up, she'll have to face her sister again with nothing, just zero info, while Klaus is already locked in and watching the next quest unfold. The girl heard that the next stop he's headed for is the evening mine. So yeah, with all that weight and his pace likely slowing down a bit, he might drop speed, but he'll still be faster than that elf on foot the whole way. Tiela yanked out several bottles of a potent recovery potion and gulped them back one after another. Then, after a couple, she hurled the empty ones aside and shattered them, ready to bolt off again. The girl sprinted after the cart, refusing to let anyone underestimate her. Then Cloud barked again, yelling for his automatic movement skill to finally kick in. And 6 hours later, the girl was already perched on a stone ledge, staring at Klaus's cart as it rolled into the valley, driven slow, smooth, and steady like it knew exactly where it was going. That dude was poring over a quest he's about to finish right here. Then the girl snapped, "Klaus is late," and said she'd been waiting for him right here the whole time. Tiela couldn't stop grinning. She'd nailed a plan so slick it left Klaus in the dust. She slipped past a checkpoint without him even noticing, then shot straight into the Valley of Sarah. She realized she couldn't reach it faster just by pushing herself. She'd already set up everything she needed, bit by bit, so now she starts remembering her route, the exact spots where she'd stopped every half hour. And somehow she's already here remembering how that girl nearly quit again and again. She dug in her heels, blurted out that she'd take on anything for the job, because at the end of the day, she was just an average ranked adventurer. She was hidden behind the trees and a maze of signs, staring at him. Then he huddled close to his donkey, telling it to pick up the pace. Tiela's grin burned bright as she practically begged him, because she refused to let him disappoint her. He cheered on his donkey as he inched closer to the last task of the day, and Tiela got ready to watch, because this time she was about to show him her real skills. Right in front of them, a fresh warning sign screamed that the next stretch was deadly and they only had 1 kilometer left to reach the valley, but the entrance was locked to anyone without gas masks. The girl had no clue why Klaus was just standing there, waiting, and the guy figured he couldn't keep letting everything ride on him. At least sometimes he had to grab the reins himself, and he was shocked it ended up right here. Tiela couldn't even tell which guy he meant. Then the guy said he'd hit the automatic resource collection, clicked down through the menu, and from the outside, it looked like he'd just fallen asleep. But while the guy sprinted off to grab the mining tools, his eyes stayed shut and his hands kept moving until he almost caught Tiela, trembling with fear. The main character kept swinging that pickaxe, cracking rock after rock like it owed him money. She stared at it, hand clamped over her mouth, trying to swallow the scream of pure surprise. He was just a few meters from her, then she realized he'd only been downstairs, and somehow a low-ranked adventurer had already caught up and slipped right behind her. Tiela couldn't tell if that guy's rank was truly so low or if someone had botched it. Then, after a string of hard hits, the slab started to crack and break. He landed a couple more precise swings, and right after that, he reached in and carefully pulled out a glowing fruit. Up close, the girl saw the guy pulling out a brand new quality mandrake root, and Tiela braced to slam her hands over her ears and let out a brutal scream. Mandrake's a cursed plant. Yank it from the earth and it erupts into a scream so lethal that anyone who hears it dies, and that deadly blast can reach up to 8 meters. Tiela flat out refused to believe there could be adventurers so inferior. Then the tears hit her like a storm. The girl stayed crumpled in the valley of sorrow, her life bar teetering on nothing, and yeah, she'd probably burned through every potion in sight. But Klaus had no clue she was there and was already walking away. When clouds finally tore back to the guild, darkness had already started creeping in. Inside the guild building, Taryn strode up to their leader, who was clutching a stack of sheets and didn't even look up. She was totally lost in what she was reading. Those were the profiles of the lower level guild's adventurers then. Taryn dropped the bomb. It was already time to take the exam and level up to the middle rank. The leader leaned in and said she was dying to see what he'd do. Taryn questioned her again, then immediately clocked who she meant. And the girl flashed a sneaky little smile. Taryn said she thinks the guy's got the skills to pass, but there's one big catch: he's been running solo the whole time, and that could slam him during the trial. She kept rifling through the reports, then snapped. With all this on the table, there's no way I can keep you stuck in a low rank. You don't even match the amount of effort you're putting in. The guildmaster leaned in and said that the work he'd done in a single week was something even the highest rank couldn't pull off. Terrence told her she might need to use force, but that guy still had to pass the exam. And the leader added that Charlotte, backed by the Class A crew, is also throwing her name into the exam, so this shouldn't turn into a real headache. The master started to spill the truth. He and a bunch of other people were hiding inside this very group. Taryn nodded, said she got it, and would go along with the recommendation. Then the girl leaned in and revealed Charlotte had an exam coming up next week. An unknown guy stood with his back to the house, then spun around and told the other person, "I've got it, go." Turns out, he was one of the Class A Special Bond crew. A certain guy let out a chuckle and said he hadn't been there in ages. He stared at an ancient photo where Klaus stood too, but the guy had been erased from it long ago, so the man holding the picture just guessed the boy was still stuck, spinning down in the lower rows. It was Gaffin Cash, the leader of that crew, laughing as he remembered the kid, and then bragging that Klaus was the weakest link in their toughest Class A group. Meanwhile, Klaus barreled toward the city under the cover of night, grinning like crazy because those two mandrakes were about to pay him 64 gold coins, plus whatever other goodies were waiting for him. Mariam drifted through the city streets, sobbing and cursing the clouds above, swearing she'd track him down and get her revenge because thanks to him, she didn't have a single coin left. Liz, Klaus's younger sister, was stuck at home all alone, staring at the pantry like it held answers, and now she was locked in on testing one of her brand new recipes, with her diagnostic skill guiding every move. She stared at the tiny vat, studied it for a second, and realized it held sauerkraut cabbage cooked with sourdough, and every time it hits the table, it comes out tangy, sour, and wildly delicious. So yeah, it was the perfect pick. Liz twirled a tiny cup of spices, grinned, and said that when you use a hot comb, cabbage always gets that perfect kick. Then she added, "That's exactly how our brother Cloud likes it." The girl kept waving those tiny forceps and singing, then snapped her head to her brother like a spark, asking if that's what Liz had just said, and if that's exactly what he thought. With a little tweak to her voice, Liz answered her own question. She agreed, and then she even tossed in that she'd make the perfect daughter-in-law, plus her brother. She said he was basically a doll, something she'd made herself. The girl kept talking in Klaus's voice, insisting there was no need to marry so soon. It was way too dangerous at that age, and then she shot back that she'd end up spending her entire life with her brother. The doll was way simpler than you'd think. You roll the towel up, fold it in half, tie it tight, and then you grab a ponytail for hair and an eggplant to finish the look. Liz spiraled with excitement and started dancing with her brother's doll, chatting to it like it could answer because she felt so lucky to have Klaus as her brother. She kept humming about how her father was a knight and how he'd been friends with Klaus's dad. After he died, Klaus's father took in Liz under the Noldor family banner, even though he himself was an adventurer, and then he vanished. Rumors swirled that his father was already gone for good. Klaus's mother couldn't take one more blow and rushed from crisis to hospital again and again, and then right out of nowhere, the girl waved, sending the doll tumbling off its spot. While all of this was going on, Klaus himself rode up to another camp meant for travelers. His donkey started chugging water, and Klaus pulled out the lunch he'd packed earlier. Liz called up an impromptu get-together for the Noldor family, then set out a spoon, a mug, a pepper shaker, and even a brother made from a towel and an eggplant. The girl clasped her hands tight, then snapped out the start of the meeting like it was about to kick off something big. Turns out, the spoon wasn't just some random thing, it belonged to the family's vassal and the Minister of Finance. And then they stacked it with a button, rice, and even a bow. Peppermint was made the Minister of Internal Affairs, and then they stitched a new mix into it: a leaf, rice, cloth, and even a brooch. The special guest wasn't really a brother. It was his doll, dressed up like him. That girl shut everyone down in one move, then blared out that she had a question worth bringing to the meeting then. Right after, she presented the dinner menu and stared the other participants down one by one. She sat in that chair while everyone else packed themselves up on the table, staring her down like she was speaking the answers to everything. Liz added that the guy had racked up 3 quests in a row, and she scanned the guests like, "You all know exactly what Klaus is doing right now. He's giving it everything." That's why she called everyone together. She's convinced this can't be an ordinary dinner tonight. Now, Liz is finally ready to hear the options. Spoon, who was basically the Minister of Finance, spoke in Liz's voice, declaring the family's economy was booming, so he swore steak was the perfect choice. The Minister of the Interior, Mr. Pepper, snapped that he saw it all differently. He ordered luxuriously cooked fish only because he was sure it would win over Klaus. She snapped everyone's eyes to the last guest, the Klaus doll, and swore that if she poured all her love into the food, her brother would take it no matter what form it came in. Right away, Liz felt heat crawl up her neck. She shoved her hands over her face, mortified. Then it hit her. Her brother always raved about the way the girl's food tasted for class. The girl figured it was totally natural to pour her love into someone then. If you're not going for the obvious choice, tell me what you're supposed to pick to dress up for a celebration. Liz locked eyes forward and tried to steady her breath. Then, out of nowhere, a voice slammed into her mind, calling out the commander and barking orders to move. She stared across at the chair because in the pot sat her beloved Spoon, the one that always stood like a tough general at the table. The Colonel General allegedly told Klaus and Joyce that the food only tasted right when she was in a good mood, and she totally blanked on it, never giving it a second thought. Liz's mind yanked her back to an incident from 3 years ago, and it instantly rattled her, upsetting her and leaving her totally confused. The girl told herself she couldn't just forget, especially with everything falling apart outside. It was evening, the sky was brutal, and rain battered the streets as Liz came home clutching a tiny grocery bag. Liz slowly slid out of her clothes and clicked the house lights on, while Klaus sat dead center in the room with his face smashed into the table, saying not a single word. That day, Lisa snapped that her brother needed to be somewhere else, like right now, but she cut herself off before she could finish the rest. Klaus fired back without hesitation that he'd quit right then, and the girl just stared, unable to believe her own ears. She asked again, pressing him to say whether he meant Gyeon's band, and when he confirmed it, joy exploded across his face like he'd just hit the lottery. About a month ago, right before all of this, the whole scene looked totally different. A stuffed cloud boomed that everything was mouthwatering, then bragged that even the food at Jean's mansion can't hold a candle to this feast. She brewed the tea, slid the cup across the table to her brother, then scooted in beside me and started grilling me about the mansion. Liz was sure Klaus's training was happening there right now. 248, and he shot back a quick yes. Then it hit him all at once and his mind latched onto it. Then Cloud started yapping that this mansion was nothing special, just a beat up, below average dump, and yeah, the floors were glass, which totally sounded cool, but cleaning a place like this? That would take years. Overwhelmed with excitement, she couldn't stop herself from peppering him with questions about what went down inside the Klaus mansion. She even thought he could jump right in and join the demonstrations. The main character shut his eyes, dipped his head slightly, and let out a grin that screamed, "I've got this." Dark clouds started pulling him back into memories of training with the whole squad, because for him, everything felt brutal, and success wouldn't come for a long time. But beyond the hands-on practical classes with their teachers, the guys dug into Monster Anatomy 2 and grilled themselves on plants, maps, and the twists and turns of dungeons. With tears burning in his eyes, he remembered every last detail, then he kept rattling off class after class and lesson after lesson like the whole endless list was still happening to him. Then the guy erupted and started bragging that his teachers were top-tier adventurers, knights of the highest rank, and how he was stuck doing brutal workouts every single day. Liz pushed him hard to stop, only in his memories could he feel it. Then the guy snapped back the demonstration. Happens just once, and in the very first fight, he lost fast enough to take less than a second to finish. After that, the guy grinned like he could still see what came next. Then Jean stomped over and held out his hand, towering over the boy with pride, while Liz crouched low, ready for the dynamo to appear. Gain shoved himself up with a grin and told Klaus to get back on his feet. Then the guy kept yapping, mocking the whole idea of learning like he knew exactly how long Klaus would stay sprawled on the ground. The main character snapped his head up, locked eyes with Gain, and shouted his name. He kept it going, palm hovering over the guy, claiming they were special. Nothing matched them. Cloud rose with a quick, respectful bow and said, yeah, but he was still way behind Gig. The guy snapped that he's fooling himself if he thinks he's got nothing left to give, and then the young man insisted, Klaus is still stuck on the first level, but we'll raise him soon. Then Garen swore there were plenty of magic stones here enough to let the guy rise again, fling his wings wide, and soar like a bird that's aching for the sky. That day, Klaus stared at his friend like he'd just witnessed greatness. Then Geen jabbed his finger at himself and declared it was time for them to seize control of the country, the one that truly belonged to them. The mouse finally cracked a smile as that inspiring speech hit his heart. And when the guy offered Geeson his hand, Geeson rose with the steady encouragement still pouring in. She frowned a little, dropped her gaze, and whispered that this was exactly how her brother used to be before everything happened at Gail's mansion. Just 20 days after Klaus struck up that special bond, the big moments started hitting one after another, and with autumn in the air, the weather stayed awful every single day. Liz sat in her chair, stitching tiny portraits, when the door slammed shut behind her and Klaus's booming voice snapped through the room he was home. His sister came tearing over, grinning, and right there on the doorway stood Klaus, beaten up by someone still smiling as he scratched his head like he couldn't stop himself. She blurted out, "What happened to his cheek?" Klaus chuckled and said, "He just face planted." Liz snatched the scissors and aimed them at her brother like they were a high-powered magnifier. Right away, the sister grabbed every medicine that might help, then pressed her brother with more questions because one look at her eyes told her the truth. He'd clearly been lying. The girl burst into screams and kept stabbing the air with her finger toward the scissors, saying even a fool could see a human hand was involved. No, wait. It wasn't just a hand at all. It was more like a fist. Klaus snapped into protest the moment he heard those details, and Liz fired back that she spots the same marks on their neighbor's husband. Every time he cheats, then he gets the punishment right away. After that, they finally simmered down, and Klaus snapped. It wasn't a real fight. Me and Gan just had a misunderstanding, and somehow it blew up into all that. The case unfolded in the House of the Rank's special connection, and when Geen shut his eyes and wiped the weapon, he snapped that it didn't match at all. While the others dug into lunch and laughed around, he shut himself off and polished his weapons, lost in his own world. The guy standing with Klaus at the counter shot back that he didn't match, and Klaus snapped. "What are you talking about?" The man said he was talking about Jin and the guild's mid-rank exam. Gain breaks it down, you're racing the clock to grab the guild's items, and he's certain the guild is still treating you like clueless newcomers even though you're the chosen ones. The guy at the counter yanked his glass off the table and said that Jin must have cooked up something wild since he started talking Glenn Boghead, that's who it was, and he went on that they'd been hanging on Geen's words, which was why he couldn't help but like him. Then he snapped that he despises mediocre poor people and bragged about his power to reshape atoms something totally unique. Shell Carmaine backed him up right away, and she told him, "Of course we'll pass this test, because that's exactly why their debut has to hit even harder." She thought the guys had a solid plan. Charlie even chimed in, saying they could prove they deserve the highest ranked title, not some run-of-the-mill recognition. Misaki Saragi, one of the team too, backed her up fast, saying it feels so good when they pay extra attention way more than everyone else, and she even suggested they head to the exam to try for the higher ranks. She spun around and fired off a question to Klaus about her lemonade, about her power, the gift of life, and how wildly unique it all was. Gillen promised their exit would be epic. He timed it so they'd suddenly burst into the square and trigger instant chaos, then unleash hell on every monster and reveal themselves as heroes right in front of everyone. With joy bursting out of him, he shot his arms up and flung them wide to the sides. Then everyone else went silent, stunned as they heard his plan. The test is locked down by battle-ready teachers, Fighter Rain, and the combat commander Abel, so Glenn demanded the details, and Jean replied that Abel had just recently caught a rock lizard. Charlie gasped that she finally understood everything, and the girl grinned and said, "Perfect then, we can use that Misty Sea. Monsters that hatch in dungeons usually don't even think about escaping. But yeah, there are exceptions." Klaus shot up from his seat, and while the others roared that it was an amazing idea and started lifting them up, he instantly snapped that it was all a joke, flat out saying they were totally overreacting. The moment he spoke, the whole room snapped silent. Everyone froze on the spot. Right then, Geen blurted out Klaus's name so calmly it terrified him. Klaus, grinning like nothing was wrong, asked what he meant. Geen clutched his hand, snapped his skill into action, and tore across the distance toward him. Gase lunged in and drove a fist straight into his cheek. Klaus never saw it coming. The main character hurled himself back from the hit, soaring through the air and smashing into part of the chairs by the bar. Locking in the stopping time on that very first level lets the elapsed time either shrink or stretch. Yeah, it's done. And that snap decision is what kicks off the management skills journey. Klaus crumpled onto the floor, admitting he was terrified, and right then, Jin burst in and laughed. "It's just a joke." Then he leaned in and demanded how Klaus was doing. Gae-in replied that the dude had just ripped through the air and slammed several meters away, and he pushed again, insisting he wanted to hear it straight. It really was Klaus who took off like that. Then he shoved the conversation aside, grilled the guy about his sickly state, and once he got the answers, he yanked the doors open and dragged him out, telling Rain to get him home. As Gain headed out the room, the main character shot his hand forward and shouted Gain's name again and again, yet Gain didn't so much as twitch. That mouse was dragged outside, then it crumpled to its knees right before the mansion and kept crying out for Ghana, refusing to stop for 10 long days until it finally left her. Liz said that ever since, her brother hasn't smiled once he treated those guys like his comrades, right up until Gale pulled that move. Later, Clouds told him the road he picked was paved with luck because that day, he finally unlocked a rare new skill, and the moment it hit, that luck slipped right out of his hands. Then he leaned in and told his sister, "I'm going to go all out. because getting that one-of-a-kind power wasn't some accident, it had to mean something. Plus lounged on his chair, staring out the window, when Liz snapped her gaze to him, eyes shining, excitement pouring out. The girl snapped her eyes shut, cheeks blazing, then suddenly blurted out what she was going to do for you, Badin, today. Liz said her brother always gives it everything, even when he ditches his group and strikes out on his own. She slumped against the table and admitted, I might not be able to do it. But she refused to quit, so she promised to back her brother up with her own cooking, dish after dish, until he never gave up. Liz barked orders at every helper packed in the kitchen, yelling to her team to grab the best dinner ingredients they could right from home. All the assistants crowded onto the table, and the moment she spoke, their eyes flared with sharp, can't-you-wait anticipation. The girl also thought, if I'm going to be a meal, I'll be the best, hottest dinner out there. She froze on the spot, yanked the thought out of her head, and shut it down fast because that kind of idea was just way too inappropriate. Then the girl went into full-on screams, whipping around to the kitchen appliances and demanding where they got those crazy thoughts because there was nothing good about it. Not this early... Voices started multiplying in her head, whispering that her moment was coming, and then she realized the rank change exam was right around the corner, even as she tried to clamp down on those thoughts. Voices inside her head kept hammering the same thing: her brother, his exam, and the moment she checked the details again, just to be sure. Then the girl blasted out a loud shout, demanding silence, and swore she wasn't like that. But one thing was clear, she was crazy about her older brother, and the cooking battle kept raging on. Before long, the conversation that would shake everything erupted at the Gain mansion. Glenn stumbled onto the street and tracked down their leader, who leaned in and told Gain that at the clan meeting, they'd just announced Klaus was joining the exam. Gain grinned and said he'd heard the rumors too. Then the guy leaned in and bragged that Klaus snagged a sponsor and even got a recommendation from the guild. Then Gain grinned and said he instantly remembered that dull exam Glenn said it was because the loser, Klaus, got saved back then, so Geen got accepted just like everyone expected. Gown grinned and said it still wasn't good enough, because their new guy was going to jump in too. That's why he was about to have a blast turning it up and making it burn hot. Terran snapped his head to the guy and said, I really grabbed every single item and I even finished 3 quests in one day. Then he added, worst case, at least 15 people could have pulled off this job. She snatched the guy by his clothes and snapped that. If that was true, then he was as good as dead right now, and just like that, she caught herself and pushed for action instead. But the moment Klaus heard it, fear slammed into him like lightning for the very first time. A thunderous shout ripped through the guild. Terran, a girl named Terran, was ordered to the 3rd reception room, and Klaus couldn't help but wonder if he'd messed up again. In the 3rd reception room, right on the table, sat Krause's application to take the middle time exam, and it even came with a fresh guild recommendation sealed tight. The boy sat at a table with 2 steaming cups of tea, lost in his reading because the papers in front of him said the Quest app was issued in his name as a brand new adventurer, and even his guild had vouched for him. Taran flashed a huge smile and clasped her hands on her skirt, then declared, loud and solemn, that she was congratulating Klaus because this was the guild's way of handing him proof they truly recognized his strength. The girl also said they'd gone over his work with a fine-tooth comb all week. Then the guild made a bold call to nominate him for the test, so now they're sending him in with one goal crush that exam. Klaus kept rubbing his face in nervous panic, ready to ask again, but the girl shot back an answer right away, saying his effort was truly appreciated, and the guild had decided to recommend that he take the exam. Klaus stayed planted, poring over the paper and rewriting his thoughts about his own hard work and recommendation stuff he literally couldn't believe he'd made until the moment it hit, and he exploded out of his seat, grinning with pure happiness. As Terran sat there clutching her fan, the guy was bouncing around on the table, yelling that he'd finally been noticed, while another guy practically burst with joy because the guild had sent his message straight to the clan. The girl begged Klaus to keep the guild building quiet, and right then, it hit. He wasn't trying for nothing. 3 years had already passed since she became the manager. Through all of this, the girl couldn't ignore how much he'd changed, because now he wasn't some weak link adventurer anymore. He pushed harder than everyone else. After that, the girl straightens up a little and whispers to the laughing young man, and Terran can't help asking, how much did you really think I worried about you all those 3 years? The girl snapped, warning Klaus again and again not to mess with higher ranking monsters, yet he kept poking his nose straight into the deadliest poison. Then the guy went and grabbed 3 quests back to back, and it completely snapped her patience. Klaus tried to rein her in, insisting he'd finally get praise today, but Terran cut right through that and started laying into him herself. She twisted her lips into a tight, smug smile and snapped that there was absolutely no reason to scold Klaus because last week kept replaying in her head and rage was exploding in her chest. The door handle suddenly went click, and Klaus snapped her head toward it, only to realize the door was locked from the outside. Terran started talking, clocking that this guy always loses his nerve the second he goes to make his move. Tarrant kept cranking up the speed, yelling that, yeah, grabbing resources is one of the most important rules yet. The dude clearly has zero clue about moderation. Right now, that girl was radiating pure menace. She basically said it was like he wanted to ruin himself and he'd do anything just to chase those quests Tarrant snapped into. If he comes back late, then call him and warn him. The guild's senpai was about to brainwash him hard, forcing him to change his ways. Then the furious tirade kept rolling straight through the night until the sun finally started to rise. A few days later, the moment everyone dreaded finally hit exam time, the one test that could boost an adventurer's rank. Klaus got swept up to take it because he'd been grinding for this day for 3 whole years. He planted his feet, eyes locked with determination, and declared, "I'm finally here, right at the exam site." So many people were packed inside, all there to take the exam too. Everyone was pacing around, trading nervous chatter, and the whole place was buzzing. Taryn barked that she'd run the calling by numbers and hand out tasks in strict queue order. Then someone suddenly grabbed the guy and shouted, "We finally found you." A strange girl's voice snapped, asking if the guy was truly single. Then she added, like it was totally obvious, that he should be shocked she knows him. It was simple. She finally stepped into view, grinned wide, and said she was just as much of a loner as he was. Then she introduced herself. "I'm Mary." Mareem lit up and blurted out, "I've got an amazing idea," then pushed everyone to team up. As Marine was crucifying herself right, while Klaus pushed his paper forward and turned away, the girl started beating the guy, screaming for him not to dare ignore her, and Taryn snapped for silence across the hall. Then Taryn leaned in and told Klaus to stay patient. He wasn't alone in this. Not really. Klaus flashed a grin and whispered that he could already hear the cold, biting warning from his own inner voice. Maureen kept pushing Klaus, bragging that they were both single and they could finally be together, yet Klaus snapped back that she should ditch him, making it clear the guy had no clue why he was somehow the problem. The girl leaned into Klaus from the back and basically said, "If I spell out the whole picture, this'll take forever." So she shrugged and dropped it in one word: intuition. Klaus was dead sure he'd finally landed a real shot 3 years after he walked out on Gearing's band. He wasn't about to let this chance slip through his fingers. After a quick pause, Taryn finally snapped. Everyone leaned in and listened as she announced, "I'm calling number 32 Charlotte, from the group Special Connection." The mouse went still the moment he heard this, because first, that band he was in was getting left behind by the guy, and second, they almost instantly snagged a replacement for him. Those clouds slid out against her skin, wriggling to dodge the truth Taryn had just spoken. Marie headed back with her explanations, saying that Special Connection isn't some mystery at all. It's a famous group because they skyrocketed to A grade 3 years ago. But Klaus couldn't stop thinking about why they'd been brought here, and when Maureen chimed in, she said she'd heard every single participant had their own special, one-of-a-kind skill. Taryn fired off the participant count, then leaned in and asked if Charlotte was in the gym right now, because if even one Class A member didn't step out, they'd straight up disqualify her. Gain showed up in the hall, grinning as he said they'd arrived, and the guy told Tara straight up not to rush like that every time she makes a statement. Gaskin planted himself right on the threshold, fully loaded in armor and ammunition. His gear blazed as people spun toward him, but Klaus refused to look, because he did not want to see that man. Klaus clenched his teeth, wrestling down the panic inside his chest, while Geen stepped forward without hesitation and started talking out loud about how long he'd been here, back when it was 2, maybe even 3 years ago. Garen strode up to Taryn and spotted his old teammate. Then he grinned through the sneaking turn, drawled the man's name, and let him know, right there, "I'm still here." Clue stood there, seething with rage. Then he stared at the boy and snapped that this was exactly why worthless Klaus had to be thrown out. And he made it happen like it was the boy's own request. Klaus slipped past that room again 3 years ago while Geen was yelling at the rest of the team about how much longer they'd tolerate that useless friend, insisting the guy should have been kicked out a long time ago. He rubbed his sword until it gleamed so bright you could see your reflection, then said he'd heard the exact same words from the rest of the team. Glenn nodded and warned that he was already at the limit. Loads of folks swore the guy was torching the whole team's reputation, but the team's magician snapped back that the leader was the one babysitting him. Then the guy just shrugged and said he'd head home. It felt like one of those kid games, but they couldn't stop thinking about that last expedition where the guy acted like some low-ranking nobody, and in a society of unique people, that was just not acceptable. The girl finished by saying that if it was too hard for Jean to tell the guy about the group's decision, she'd do it herself, yet Jean said it wasn't needed. Right then, Klaus was standing by the door, soaking up every word. Gain kept staring at his blade and muttered that this was the man the leader had personally shaken hands with, and if this group really understood him, they'd be ready to tell him about one key thing. But Gain also said that right now, from the team's own mouths, it's starting to sound like they're judging him like, "You don't know how to pick people." And Klaus was the living proof. The guy who'd been mentioned then snapped, "We're leaving it all like this." And when he whipped out his skill, it instantly sent those guys into full-blown panic. Almost together, everyone blurted that it wasn't true, trying to talk Jean into it. "You can be sure," they insisted, and Galvat wiped his sword away, right then, warning that this world is packed with bad people. Then he snapped that they couldn't kick him out themselves, no matter how useless he claimed he was, because they'd have to set everything up so he would choose to leave on his own. Klaus was still planted by the doorway when he heard it. All this was going down in no time. Then the guy leaned in and promised that in their next fight, they'd set up an accident. After that talk, everything unfolded exactly like Jean promised, miserable, brutal, and pushing them to the edge, because they were dead set on wiping out that week from their group no matter what it took. That's when Klaus got nothing left, empty pockets, his money ripped off, and pinned on some accident trick. And that same day, a furious Klaus walked out of the group on his own, just like they claimed. Klaus snapped his gaze back to Gellin, sneering with pure contempt. If he'd had the chance, he would have swung with every ounce of strength and clocked this scoundrel. After that, Klaus suddenly snapped back to the question about why he was even there, so he swallowed his fear, stood his ground, and declared, "This is my hometown," then shot back that he had no clue what Geen could possibly have forgotten here. Klaus spun around, headed for another corner to put distance between them, and without even looking back, he flat out said he had nothing to do with Gillen. Then he urged him to get out of here ASAP. Gaston chuckled at what he heard. Then the guy added that they were only doing it so Klaus wouldn't be so rude, and that they had come to escort their friend because he was about to take the exam. After yanking his hair into place, the special bond boss calmly told them this in just 2 years. Literally anyone can scrape together the title of an average adventurer, even if they're mediocre. Gas kept gloating like he owned the place, bragging that they could toss the old ways aside and enjoy the meeting. Then he threw his arms wide and announced, Klaus finally showed up for the exam after 3 long years. Gating's words were already slicing into Klaus's ears, and Klaus couldn't stand it anymore, so he couldn't stay away. The final thing Gating said was that he couldn't help admiring him. Then the guy snapped free and yelled for Gibran right away. Morim slammed between them, stopping Klaus from losing it and yanking him back from pure stupidity. The girl claimed she'd overheard the entire conversation, then snapped that even if they were famous A-class adventurers, Klaus was her comrade, and she'd never let anyone insult him. The girl snapped into a fighting stance and screamed that she wouldn't let Gain speak to her friend like that, because if he kept it up, he'd have to fight her. Klaus barked that the girl could attack him if she wanted. Then right then, fear flickered in his eyes as he realized he needed to step in and calm things down. The guy clutched his own hand like it was about to ignite. Klaus knew he was gearing up to use his power and sprint straight toward the marriage, and Gengan even said, "That's exactly what you should expect from the village and all those noisy bugs." Mariam shrieked that she'd crush Gain herself, but the clouds yanked her up and urged her to move faster because Terran was about to scold them all. A mouse was slowing Mariam down. Then he thought, man, Jean's insanely good at poking people, and the more he watched, the more he figured Jean would snap and raise his hand at anyone, even a girl if he got mad. Still holding Miriam, Klaus Frown blurted out how thankful he was to her because it was clear that was exactly what she'd been aiming for, and the next second, she was standing tall, laughing softly. When Terran dialed 33, Maureen shot her hand up and yelled, "I'm on my way." And then the girl added that she and Klaus are on the same team now. Klaus had zero clue what was happening as Terran hit record, and the guy exploded into loud objections until the guild's boss snapped at him to shut up, then declared the roll call officially over. A brand new face from Class A's feedback group started closing in on their leader. Then Charlotte said, "All right, now you can talk about resources." Jean told the girl, "Don't you dare vanish from my sight." Then he turned serious and added, "You don't even get how powerful your abilities are." Finally, the girl shoved over a paper and said, "My name is..." Terrence shot up and shook her head as Maureen thrust a task sheet at them, and Charlotte jabbed the guy with her finger, saying he was the claws their leader always picked as the heart of their team. He grinned so wide it hurt and said, "Yeah, that's exactly it." Then he begged the girl to ignore him during the exam, because today, this guy was guaranteed to show up. The leader kept that grin locked on his face and told them they'd use the girl as their ace. Charlotte laughed back, saying Klaus smelled like something special. Right as she was about to leave, she muttered that even if that guy got pecked, he'd still shrug it off and move on, and deep down, the girl just knew this exam wasn't going to go the way Jillian wanted. He didn't even listen to the girl when she said that he just smirked and claimed everything was running like clockwork, because in his mind, every last one of his plans was already coming true. Everyone bolted for the door, and Klaus stayed still, quietly scanning the other participants, trying to figure out if he should fear one of them more than the rest. Once everyone finally piled back on the starting line, Klaus and Miriam bolted forward on Terrence's command to kick off the mid-level adventurer exam. That list is packed with wild stuff: royal champignons, a ghoul's lower jaw, hot cave slime, small nuts, a deer horn, leather keys, Salazar's replacement, and the red thread of dawn. Under the guild's rules, you can pick any 3 things from that list: grab them, and haul them back. Marie clutched a scrap of paper and shouted at Klaus, telling him to check her list because it had up to 4 things that matched. With zero hesitation, the girl leaned in and told Klaus he could count it as a win. The exam was done, right there in front of them, wearing matching deer horns, a ribbon of red dawn, and a ghoul's jaw. Plus clutched the reins with rage in his veins, while the girl kept talking, saying they can't just relax, they have to split their time properly so they can gather every single item. And the girl who raised her finger said she'd start with the deer horn, because that one looked like the toughest challenge on the entire list, and then she demanded Cloud's opinion too. Dark clouds loomed overhead as he kept staring straight ahead, convinced Miriam was a loud menace who wouldn't let him catch a single breath during the entire exam. Klaus spun back and snapped at Mareem to stop already, and Mareem shot back that he shouldn't ignore her. Then she flashed a thumbs up and declared, "We're a team." The mouse snapped that he was sick of all of this already. Then the guy fired back, "Time to end it," and dropped his plan because he'd already picked the spot he was going to stake his claim. Marine stared at the screen, trying to figure out what skill that guy was using. Then Klaus threw in an apology, said he'd handle it solo, and slammed the button to dash straight to the cemetery. So the auto drive to the cemetery kicks in. She still has that second level, and by the rules, she has to land the guide who's due to arrive in just an hour. His eyes slowly fought to stay open, and all he could hear was Mary muttering that the guy was finally nodding off. Then Sudi found himself in the cemetery where the crew insisted they had to go in. Klus turned, flashed a smile, and swore he hadn't been here in ages yet. The place looked exactly the same, like time refused to touch it, even though this cemetery was supposed to be crawling with ghouls. The second the guy spun around, Marine was gone, vanished like a snap of the fingers. He couldn't stop himself from saying it was great, since the girl fell out of the cart on the ride over and that donkey somehow runs like it's on a mission. But Miriam kept her grip on the wagon, thrusting her staff into one of the holes so he could hang on. Then she heard him out and screamed that Klaus was a total scoundrel. Mariam snapped that he could have warned her at least once, and Cloud blared back that he'd already clocked just how stubborn the girl tailing him was. The cemetery was split into 2 floors, skeletons only on the top but right beneath. The medium and high-level ghouls lurked where Klaus knew they'd be. Because they were aiming for the ghoul's lower jaw, they couldn't afford to linger. Maureen rocketed forward, smashing one skeleton after another, and even that freaked the guy out. Klaus kept striking back, and the girl finally realized he wasn't so bad after all, honestly. It made sense, because he was a loner too, just like her. Klaus snapped to a stop the moment the truth hit. He wasn't Klaus at all because the other guy had been walking for 3 straight years, while Maureen took off the second she got her skill, and in that guild, achievement scores mattered more than status. Maureen spun around and demanded to know what was wrong. Klaus insisted it was all fine, but she caught the shock in his eyes the second he saw her talent. Clouds even wondered if he'd stumbled into a mind-reading power, so he pressed, demanding to know where the girl was from. But Mareem insisted it was crystal clear every person she'd teamed up with had the same kind of face staring back at her. The girl blurted out that admiration for Klaus hit her like lightning, while the guy swore it was probably the other way around until Maureen's magic made everything far more complicated. Right then, a whole army of skeletons crawled out ahead of them and slammed the path shut. Cloud began to slow, but Miriam didn't stop for a second, powering forward like nothing could slow her. The girl lowered her stance, surged forward with her staff, and fired back. "This is exactly what I need." She was going to prove herself to him right now, so he'd finally see the real strength she's got. Her look hardened into pure determination. Then she declared she'd handle every last skeleton herself. Right after Maureen was about to show her strength, the girl slammed the staff into place and energy started pouring out of it like a weapon in motion, racing straight toward Klaus. The tree sat far from the guy, then crack it split wide open, its base crumbling from the blast, and right after that, the whole thing came crashing down. Thank the stars, the tree didn't crush the guys. Its trunk slammed down onto a small building in the cemetery crypt, and the moment it hit, the skeleton crowd froze dead in the way. A tree slammed down on the tiny temple like a cannon shot. Boom! And the whole building started to buckle and crumble, right onto the monsters below. Then, at last, a chunk of the building crashed down and slammed the skeleton straight back into the earth. They'd clawed their way out of hard Miriam's pace, dropped instantly as they ducked for cover, bracing against the storm of dust rocketing toward them. No monsters blocked their path, just rubble and debris everywhere. Miriam stayed stone still, completely baffled by how it all went down, while Klaus screamed at the top of his lungs. The guy with that wild, crazy stare whipped his head toward Mary, clutching the same bone he'd used to fight her earlier, and then he came lunging at her slow at first, but closing fast until the beam clipped the clouds and singed the hair on his head. Mariam shot her finger at herself and grinned, saying everything turned out great, then asked Klaus what he thought only for him to suddenly lunge at her. She snapped, "Calm down," and then admitted she never meant it that way. Even after the crypt collapsed, one part stayed standing while the ruined section crushed the enemies beneath it. Klaus then bolted away with a sharp, quick step. The girl started sprinting to catch up, blurting out that she'd admit her mistake and be way more careful next time. But he was seething and screamed at Mareem to stay behind while she insisted, through the chaos that they were still friends. Then she bragged that they could wipe out over 10 skeletons at once and save a bunch of time, and Cloud shrugged like it didn't matter, since that girl had nearly cut his life short. Marine let out a chuckle. Picturing skeletons and ghouls, the girl snapped that they were the monsters they'd crush next and that every one of them feared fire. Then she swore she'd prove she was stronger this time. Clue slammed his hand into a fist and snapped that he'd bet on being burned alive before anything like that, because the more he stared at it, the clearer it became why Marine turned into a loner. He defiantly coughed hard, grabbed everyone's attention, and snapped his gaze to Mary. Then he said it was time for a serious conversation, and she immediately blurted, "What happened back there?" Clue snapped at her, demanding Marine listen to him. Suddenly, the dungeon entrance was smashed shut with a pile of stones, and a crowd of other adventurers waited outside, tense and ready. Klaus's rage exploded the moment he saw it. Marine snapped that they probably couldn't reach their destination anymore. Then, out of nowhere, a voice from the side shouted that the passage was blocked right now. A gravedigger-looking man with a pipe sat on a huge tombstone and nodded like he meant it, then pointed and declared that a top-level boss had been spotted inside the boss's room. After that, he added that the guild crews had gone too far into the danger and then slammed the entrance shut on the subjects. Suddenly, everyone's attention snapped to the entrance, and the crowd surged to look because the people blocking the doorway seemed like they were protecting someone. The fog finally lifted, and Klaus's rage surged as he snapped, "This is just a dungeon cleanup, so the boss we found, someone already wrecked it." Merim immediately scanned the area and asked if the weather really shifts at a time like this. Then Klaus bowed his head and said, "Yeah, as long as every last monster vanishes." Then Klaus dropped the bombshell that it applies to their goal too, so yeah, the entrance doesn't make sense anymore. The main character bared his teeth and snapped that he couldn't understand why that man had bothered to clean the crypt at all. A man started to crawl out of the dungeon, and Klaus kept staring, eyes locked on him like nobody else in the crowd was. Not with those fake smiles for the Class A Special Bond crew. Merim demanded, "Is he the one?" And right then, Glenn burst out of the dungeon grinning like a maniac, cradling in his hand the skull of a high-ranking monster he pulled straight from the boss room. The girl stared at the main character. Stunned, Klaus snapped the man's name as he crawled out of the crypt. She blurted out, "Do you know him?" And he answered with a quick, confident yes. The main character said the kid was 18-year-old Glenn Bogus, and before you know it, Glenn, still fresh from his old crew, spotted Klaus, spun around, and told him, "Man, we haven't seen each other in forever." He even added that the guy hasn't changed one bit. He's still stuck in this dead, pointless little place like nothing ever moved. Cloud blurted that Glenn looked completely lost, then fired a straight question. What is an A-rank adventurer doing here? Cloud knew they were just trying to trip him up at every turn. Glenn barked out a laugh and told Klaus he was probably dumb for even asking about that stuff. Then the man insisted he was only helping Klaus. As Glenn started coming down, Klaus shot him a furious question. What was this all about? Glenn snapped back that Geen was one of the jurors and he'd be watching every exam taker closely. Then he jabbed at the girl clutching a skull on a tray. Glenn said the guy was insanely lucky because today, pure chance dragged in a top-tier boss and the adventurer ended him. Glenn burst into laughter and told Klaus he didn't owe him a thing. Then he smirked and said he doesn't even know what Klaus would have paid for those lives if Glenn hadn't been there. Then Glenn burst out laughing and told the guy to get ready because with luck, even accidents like that could happen again. So he better try to grab at least one item. Glenn rushed up to his horse and asked the girl where they'd hit next, only for Cloud to burst out, demanding to know what this was all about. Yet, Glenn was already headed for the Red Mountain stream and shrugged it off. Klaus's rage flared up fast, and suddenly one thought hammered through his head. This crew was back to its old business, bullying him again, and he was done taking it. Mariame had no clue what was happening. None of it made sense. She couldn't follow what Glenn was saying, couldn't see where he was headed, and couldn't figure out what any of it even meant. And Klaus? He admitted he didn't get it either. Klaus spits it out, whatever it means, and Glenn immediately gets under his skin, big time, and Klaus is not about to let this smart-mouthed kid wreck the exam because he's convinced Glenn will end up getting himself seriously hurt. The main character paused for a split second, already knowing they'd keep butting in, so he had to figure out exactly how to move next to come out on top. Snatching his bag, the guy blurted that this wasn't some game. Then he bolted the other way, yelling he'd just had an interesting thought. Mariam stayed put and watched him disappear. He lunged onto his cart, figuring if they wanted to beat him, they'd have to pry ahead of him themselves, so he lost it. Then he yanked open the skill panel, snarling that he'd smashed the automatic function at full power. Klaus kept rolling the panel, bursting into laughter, telling them to stare close because he was about to prove just how much he'd changed. Then he slammed the skill field to life. Meanwhile, another adventurer from the Special Bond crew was already waiting at the other dungeon, tucked near the mountainside way, deep inside the shining O Mountains. The whole field was stitched with flowers, blooming and reaching for that bright, warm sun. Then the sky snapped shut, the clouds rolled in fast, and a brutal downpour crashed down, soaking and burying all that beauty. Right in the middle of spring, Snow suddenly began to fall, and the girl with that special connection, the one who can bend the weather, stood on a stone and slowly started to unleash her power. With special movements, the girl snapped into full focus, then threw her hands up, and boom, a blizzard and a raging snowstorm erupted across the street. The girl burst into laughter, then snapped that Klaus was a total fool, watched the guy come closer, and said Gieson already knew exactly what he was going to do. She kept talking, begging those clouds to roll in right now, ready to crash into her icy, tightening embrace of the weather, while the sky and the forest climbing up toward the foothills darkened and turned brutal, and the trail ahead got blanketed in snow. An enraged Yeti started descending the mountain, and the girl swore she'd freeze Klaus's body and soul solid, while the guy sat there with his eyes shut and kept pushing forward, deeper and deeper into danger. While the novice adventurers were scrambling through their rank upgrade exam, the Adventurers Guild itself was in full chaos, and in the guest room, an absolutely wild conversation was tearing the silence apart. 2 guards Jen had stationed were also posted on watch, ready and alert. Footsteps thundered down the corridor, and every guard snapped their heads around because they'd just been informed their return was happening. It was Rain and Glenn who finished their assignments first. Glenn ran the subordination like a wrecking crew and wiped out every boss in that area, while Rain carried out the crackdown too, killing all the bosses there as well. As soon as they stepped into the room, they blurted out that everything was done exactly the way Gain asked, and Rain chimed in that her mission was a success too. Then Gain snapped that they were brilliant because they were smartly strapped. While everyone else waited, Guess hunched over a map, sprawled across the table right in front of him, so Glenn said it was easy that he barely stayed awake. He asked if they were doing okay, and Green shot back a confident yes. Right there, a sheet laid out Claus's tasks, and they started crossing off every trial he couldn't figure out. Glenn leaned in and said, "There's barely anything left." Gain grinned wide, then solemnly said Klaus had nothing left. Then he leaned in, stared back at the papers, and added with a cold edge that that little scoundrel had the same fate waiting for him too. Glenn clocked it right away. Some hired goons had orders to wipe every low-level dungeon near the city clean, right where the special bond had just left. Jean says, heading to the window, that all that's left are the high-level dungeons. Sure, it's like 2 fingers from the asphalt for them, but one stupid exam decides their fate. Geltine spread his arms again, solemn as a judge, and told them they couldn't let their little friend slip through this exam because that's exactly what they're aiming to stop right now. Glenn let out a grin as he eyed his leader, then instantly snapped that he agreed this year's exam was way too easy, and that's why at first they played it safe and stayed cautious about the risks. Bogos also admitted that at first, he saw it differently. Glenn figured Gain was just bored and messing around, and even then, the leader paused time just to scan the task list. Gensen kept grinning at every word Glenn threw out. Then Bogo chimed in that their boss had dumped a ton of money into making all this happen, and Gensen only shrugged, saying Klaus was just a bug. Jean leaned in on what else mattered and said they'd stay special, which was exactly why they got all those privileges, and then he turned the spotlight on pointless nobles, trashing them one by one. Glenn burst out laughing, claiming he was speaking for the grandmother, furious and fading, and then Jean chimed in that only the strongest truly deserve to live, before saying she'd be thrilled to see such an exam. No matter what, they always stood out, so when Glenn passed his exam, he basically shrugged and said he didn't care what happened to the guildmaster and whether she lived or died. It didn't change a thing. Then Glenn shot up a finger, sank into a cushy chair, and solemnly announced that only their brilliant girl and maybe the disastrously incompetent bug, Klaus Nordal, would still be alive. Bogos also dropped some new news. He said he'd learned the class is heading north now, because the guy watching them told him so, and then he immediately made a guess and asked again which way they were going. Rain burst into the conversation, folding her hands behind her back, and the girl figured Klaus was now making for the mountains right up near those eastern clouds. Gens admitted it, this really was the most remote beginner dungeon, the kind you can reach on a day trip. But even so, they still hadn't managed to get there yet with all their hard work. Even so, the leader's smile didn't budge. Gain swore these fools wouldn't stand a chance because in this place, nature itself is stacked against him, and now there's someone who can control the weather. While the special bond crew bragged about the filthy things they were doing to the Klauses group, the guy himself was out in a snowy mountain battleground. Snow animals suddenly swarmed him and he had to fight for his life. There were tons of them, and right then, it felt like fate finally admitted Klaus couldn't be left alone on this journey. The sound started creeping in fast, and Klaus and Mechrom huddled back to back, bracing themselves for the attack. Out of nowhere, the monsters panicked and bolted in every direction, and Klaus and Marim just stood their ground, staring as the monkeys scattered. Snow monkeys were low-tier monsters, haunting the cold months and the warmer ones too. Since they hibernated there in the heat, they were classed as mountain monsters, and living in huge packs made them notoriously hard to rouse from their slumber. Maureen shot her fist up and yelled at nature like it was doing her wrong, and the girl turned deep into the mountains, begging nature to snap to its senses because it was the dead heat of summer. Cloud started cursing at full volume, ranting about how gaming had gotten under his skin and asking who could possibly reach him even here. Then Marine spun around and caught him yelling that the snow was falling thanks to someone's help. They stood on a high ledge, and from there, everything was crystal clear, so Cloud nodded, raised his hand to the side, and told Mareem to look up at the sky. There was a stretch of land where the magic abruptly quit, and right after it ended, Klaus snapped that there's only one person who could pull off something like that and bring the weather to heal Shane Carme. Klaus even admitted that 3 years ago, that girl was already unbelievably capable at level 1. She could predict the weather with total precision, and at level 2, she could actually take control of it. After that, Klaus couldn't believe it. No one had ever realized the girl's power could grow this much after all this time, while Marine kept staring at the truth, wondering why, until Nordahl finally cut in. There was something else. He clutched his bag in one hand and snapped open the skill panel with the other, while Klaus flicked his free hand and kicked on automatic resource collection. As Klaus kept staring at the panel, he couldn't shake the feeling that his special bond still didn't have proof he'd truly leveled up, because now his automatic resource haul works in any weather, meaning he'll finally be able to grab nuts and apples no matter what. But the real problem stayed. Icy packing alone would take 2 hours, 55 minutes, and 18 seconds, and whether there's time for everything else is a complete mystery. Klaus paused for a second, then flashed a grin because the truth hit him like a lightning bolt. He didn't need to overthink it at all. He should have just gone for it right then. Mareem stood beside him and stared at Klaus, who stayed stone silent, wrestling with thoughts of his own. Then the girl leaned in and asked what Nordahl was planning to do. At that moment, the girl grabbed the guy by the shoulder and snapped that she had zero clue what was going on in his head right then, and that it wasn't worth it to risk anything with Russian in the middle of it. She warned they could make a mistake, and that would be heartbreaking. Klaus said, calmly as a blade, "I'm totally with you." And then the guy warned that Mary should come back because that would turn everything way more dangerous. Mariam slowly turned to Klaus because Nordahl told her to try it, even if only for a little while. Then he leaned in and said he'd stumbled on an amazing surprise during their hike together. Klaus told her he loved fighting shoulder to shoulder with her, then almost too calmly added that it's great being with someone who can at least partially cover your back. Marine kept shouting for Klaus, but his voice snapped and he cut the guy off mid-intensity. Then Klaus shrugged it off and said he'd always been a loner, and he always would be. Then he barked that if he used his skill, Marine couldn't catch him anyway, so Marine had no choice but to turn back right then. In the end, Klaus roared at the top of his lungs, demanding his third-tier auto-collection function kick in, and the spot where the guy stood erupted into a violent geyser of snow, blasting upward. Marie squeezed her eyes shut, then opened them slowly, one by one, and as the world sharpened, she saw the spot where Klaus had been was completely empty. Marim got stranded in the dead middle of a snow-choked forest, all alone, so she whispered her teammate's name under her breath, desperate to figure out where he'd vanished to. Then she screamed Klaus's name even louder, begging him to come back, yet Klaus was already long gone. The collection led that guy straight into a mountain cave, and inside, he'd already uncovered something. As the countdown finally bled down to 0, the guy jolted his eyes open, proof that the skill had done its job, and that Klaus was clawing his way back to consciousness. The guy stood before the bush of caramel apples, its surface stitched in a beautiful pattern, and when Klaus looked down, he saw he was already holding the 5 pieces he needed for the list. Klaus lit up with joy and shouted that his very first mission was finally done. Then he started stuffing the apples into his bag, grinning as he said everything was going perfectly so far. Now he had to figure out his next move. Then everything snapped into focus as a guy suddenly went wide-eyed when he heard someone yelling and charging over, crunching through the snow. Turns out, the apple bush was right there close enough that Maureen and I were basically standing next to it. And the moment she spotted him, she bolted straight toward Klaus. Meanwhile, Klaus's mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do next. Fear and rage wrestled across Mareem's face, and she sure as hell didn't want Klaus to leave that girl here stranded in the middle of winter, surrounded by monsters. 2.5 hours till they reached the next stop, and Maureen was about to get wiped out. No way she'd catch up to the guy after this. He called out goodbye to Mary, hoping like hell he wouldn't end up sick. He only caught the order to stop, but there was no time to hesitate. He instantly flipped on the automatic collection the moment his cooldown cleared and the countdown hit the timer. When Klaus finally snapped awake, he scanned the room like, it's over, right? He opened his eyes, sure the skill was done, so why couldn't he see a single thing? All Klaus could feel was the brutal cold biting his hands and then something hard and small pressed into his palm. He blinked, startled, and snapped to it. It was a nut. Klaus started stuffing the nut into his bag. Then he made a snap decision, grabbing the magic stone sitting nearby and yelled for the light to come bursting out. That red stone snapped to life, and the guy instantly realized he'd been dumped somewhere on the street. Snowdrifts piled around him, and a medium-sized tree stood nearby. The second the guy started to rejoice, he spotted it. Those snowdrifts weren't just snow at all. They were healthy snow yetis, and the moment they woke up from the light, they burst into growls. Just when it felt like nothing could get worse, Klaus stayed right on his feet, blazing light into the dark while those evil Yeti's paws kept stretching for the boy and the magic stone. Marine stood there, eyes blazing, and drove a mountain of magic into her staff. No hesitation, all determination, because she was about to unleash an attack that demanded pure, brutal strength. The girl kept swinging right beside the abyss, and across the gap, Klaus stared at her, suspicious as hell, convinced she was furious with him. Mariam shrieked to Klaus, screaming that danger was creeping up behind him, and it didn't take Nordahl long to realize he was in serious trouble. He could only squeeze out a tiny sound as Mariam screamed, then a brutal charge tore toward him, and Klaus backed off fast to dodge. Klaus dropped low to the ground and kept moving, and that's when he saw Mariam's ball streaking toward the monster one step away from the boy while Nordahl still had no idea how to get out. That massive burst of magic that tore free from the girl's staff smashed straight into the center chest of a YETI. Right where he stood, Klaus snapped his hands up to his face as the creature crumpled and fell, face first, into the snow. Marine was still stuck across from her friend, so she screamed at the monsters to look at her instead and leave Klaus alone. Klaus stared at it all with wide, dumbfounded eyes, while the girl kept shrieking that she couldn't afford to let her travel partner get dragged into the clutches. One of the Jedi started to growl, his battle cry so loud it nearly tore the air apart. Then the monsters charged straight at Marine, who was cowering behind her staff. Klaus sprawled in the snow, fighting to lift himself, while Marine snapped at him to scramble up and vanish before they even realized what hit them. And Sayedi, who got slammed by the charge, came out nearly fine and stared at the magician with pure, furious rage. Snatching a nearby log, the Yeti hoisted it over his head like he meant business and lined up the throw. Marum instantly clocked the target, and her worst fears hit as she realized she was next. Swinging with everything it had, the snow monster slammed a log shattered by Marim's magic straight into its mark, landing the hit dead on. The girl got flung aside, but she clamped down on her weapon and kept fighting. After that brutal hit, Maureen couldn't move. She lay sprawled in the snow, softly groaning as the collision with a huge frozen log crushed her with pain. The clowns leaned in for a closer look, and there she was, still alive. He couldn't help but think she'd gotten pure luck. The snow underneath cushioned the impact, killing most of the fall's force and turning a deadly drop into something she could survive. The Yetis kept closing the distance, swelling their pack with a fresh recruit. Now there were about 6 of them total, all staring straight at the girl on the far side of the slope. After the wounded Yeti shrieked again, the rest snapped to attention and sprang up, desperate to cross to the other side and finally square up with their abusers. Plus snapped upright and scanned the battlefield, tracking every move the monsters made. Then they totally blanked him and thundered straight to the other side. But Klaus couldn't figure out why any of this was happening. He figured they were going after Messroom just because she had magic, so the guy yanked out his blade and started slicing through the enemies from behind. Since that Yeti crashed into one of the pack, it didn't care about the guy at all, and the rest kept charging toward Mareem, who was still stuck there, sprawled and freezing in the snow. He flipped open the panel and pointed at 2 killer options, auto battle and automatic return. Time was slipping away fast if he walked out alone right now. He'd finally have just enough time, and Klaus couldn't shake the feeling that the Yetis were monsters on a whole other level, because he knew, cold and clear, they'd rip them to tiny pieces in a blink. Then he sprang off the ground and, just like the Yeti, launched himself over the ravine, smashing through the monsters on the way. The guy slammed the brakes in front of Marine, whipped around, and faced the monsters crowding in on the girl. As the mouse slammed his panel back open and picked automatic combat, the guy snapped that it'd be fine just this once, but warned her that Mouse isn't her friend. The panel lays out the goal, take down the snow giant with 8 pieces, and the fight drags on for 10.5 minutes as Marine fights through it, barely managing to pronounce Nordahl's name. 138, Klaus shot daggers at the top monsters, then slammed his answer down. He wasn't handing them Marine, and he warned the girl to hang on a bit longer, just 10.5 more minutes. That's Klaus' plan to push through, and he still insists she remember the truth. They're not friends. The adventurer is free to walk away because he might never save her and he won't get a single reward either. But Klaus will do it. The Yeti split apart and swept 2 guys into its crew, and Klaus shot his hand up, ready to trigger his automatic battle skill, while Merrim kept his eyes locked on every single move. Everything happened in seconds. Those Yetis panted and leaned in, ready to strike. Then Klaus started to break apart bit by bit. Because the system had already finished its analysis, his body kept fading into nothing, piece by piece, and Maureen's mind just couldn't catch up. Klaus never told her about the power he had. Maureen pushed herself up, gritting out her name as she rose, then the wind roared near the Yetis standing ahead, blasting the snow aside. She screamed his name at the top of her lungs and still nothing answered, while the nearby Yetis snapped into growls and menaced the air. Ice giants were the winter mountain monsters mid-tier in the food chain, but they still slept standing up, and every time they woke, they hit the world with instant misery. Up on those snow-capped peaks, people whispered that they were the mountain's invisible killers, and Mareem rubbing his eyes, realized why even the monsters up here are deadly to the best adventurers. Because when they strike, you can't see them coming. Miriam didn't even look at Klaus. She felt how terrifying things had gotten, and she knew they had to act right now before monsters crashed into a girl's life and stole away what her magic could do. Up in the high mountains, that crew set up a tent and burned 2 huge bonfires, and the moment a certain guy used his sharp listening skills, he followed his mistress and delivered his report. The man admitted he obeyed every demand from his mistress, and then, oh my god, he definitely heard Cloud scream. That's when the lie chain revealed who ordered 8 giants to be unleashed on the boy. Right then, the girl grabbed everything she needed, warm drink in hand, and asked the staff to bring more firewood, because the chill was creeping in and freezing everything up. The man snapped back, warning that with just a little more, their tent would start burning. The girl slammed her glass onto a small table and cackled. Then she declared she was done here and walked off. Chain also said she had zero doubt the 8 mountain giants would handle the task, and she made it clear they'd never leave their victim hanging. As for Klaus, he could deal with them however he wanted. She yanked open the tent, slipped out, and sprinted straight for the guild, knowing her info would help guilds forge a glorious future, yet she couldn't figure out why Klaus was actively getting in his way. But even so, she still didn't trust Klaus at all, because ever since those days when he was in a band, his whole connection with everyone has been sending shivers down her spine. After a quick pause, Shireen snapped back into motion, laughing as she said she even envied how much attention Galeen and Nordal got, because that was exactly why he never should have been allowed to live. Her lips quivered in the cold, but that vicious, creeping smile wouldn't budge off Shane's face, while the girl silently bid Klaus farewell and wished he'd burn in hell. Miriam still couldn't fully recover. Pushing herself to her feet took everything she had, pure willpower and grit, and she swore Klaus was gone again, just like before, and she was left behind. The girl couldn't process what she was seeing. She kept yelling, begging to know how Klaus was holding up, but all she heard were the thunderous sounds of giants, and panic started to bloom. What if he'd already been taken down? Soon, the first blood spilled to the ground. One of the Yetis snapped into a scream, but it wasn't that raging roar from before. It came out as a weak, choking whine. Marine peeked out from behind the stone and sprinted toward the noise, and the girl watched the monster crumple, those glassy eyes lifting to the sky as it finally admitted defeat. He was already dead. The other monsters snapped into panic right away, whipping their heads left and right, while not understanding who or where the attack on the Marm came from, not understanding what was happening at all, griped the staff even tighter. She couldn't put it into words any other way. Those giants closing in on each other huddled up, then gradually died, because something was cutting them down at such a blur of speed that no one could even see it. Suddenly, staring at the 2 monsters, the girl spotted a ghost-like man so faint he was barely there standing with a blade, and in the next breath, his weapon lifted and arced straight over the giant's back. Marine crouched in hiding, eyes locked on this field like a trap was about to snap, because the moment she vanished, that thought hit me hard. It's close. Klaus's ghostly silhouette yanked the monster's jaws back, then he drove his blade straight into the exposed neck, steel biting in, flesh giving way instantly. One of their Yetis, freshly hit by the blade, managed to stay upright for a moment, wobbling left and right before finally staggering forward with 2 big steps and collapsing beside Mary. Maureen refused to give up. She snapped into a scream, begging Klaus to answer, terrified to the bone, because she needed to know where he was and how he was pulling it off, and the silence was crushing her. Staring at the body of another Yeti, the girl realized the worst part: Klaus was fighting those giant invisible monsters all by himself, even armed with nothing more than a tiny little knife. Miriam couldn't crack what skill Klaus had to offer, and her mind immediately jumped to the worst. Maybe he was the killer, she just needed to know what else he was secretly hiding from his girlfriend. But right now, all that mattered was one thing. Could that guy outmatch them all? Mareem kept praying the Yetis wouldn't spot his tricks. One of the Yetis spotted a tiny tuft of hair and instantly feared it was the second lurker, the one now slaughtering his comrades. The crest was stamped right on the snowball. Marine was hiding behind, then the girl clocked it. One of the Yetis was lining up its throw at the magician, ready to smash that lump. With one savage swipe of his paw, the Yeti shattered the snow barricade in an instant, right where Marine was hiding. Yet the girl barely managed to leap aside and dodge it. Right away, she clocked it if that Yeti had struck. Then he'd absolutely seen Klaus too. Snow had dusted and smeared the girl's face. And as she caught her breath, she burst into frantic shouts for her friend's name. A tiny lock of the guy's hair ripped free and whipped through the air, twitching and dancing left to right in the gust, while the monster and Marine stared at the odd move like it was a signal. She snapped her mouth shut, cutting off the guy's name the second it hit her. This could be a trap, right? Overhead, the Yeti towered and bared its teeth, raging like it wanted to tear her apart. Marine tried to crawl backward, frozen with pure terror. Out of nowhere, Mareem Klaus burst into view right in front of her, dropping to his knees and gripping his blade tight, eyes shut as if in a prayer, while Mareem clamped her hand over her mouth to keep from letting out a scream. The second the Yeti stepped forward, The boy, still with his eyes shut, shot upright like a spring and drove his knife straight into the ice giant's jaw. Mariam snapped her eyes open, stunned by what had just happened to the guy, because the moment she looked at him, she knew he wasn't the same anymore, not in any way. And she was sure of one thing: she'd never seen him like this before. The girl froze on the spot and watched Klaus signal the last two Yetis to come at him, and Marine just knew Klaus was going to do something legendary someday. Her gut and heart screamed the truth, and Klaus stayed planted, eyes shut tight, bracing himself as the enemies prepared to strike. The last mountain giant froze in terror, staring at the dead relatives scattered around him, his panic screaming for answers because his eyes were hunting the boy with the blade who had done this. The second the monster spotted the young man's body, it tore across the ground and let out a savage roar, its terrifying scream bouncing off the mountains and sending pure terror through every living thing around. Trapped beneath the snow, Klaus thrust his blade straight into the beast's gaping mouth, and just like that, it was over. He yanked his hand back, dropped into place, and the Yeti collapsed right beside him. The fight was finally over when the timer hit 0. The monster souls ripped free of their bodies and burst into the world as chilling ice ghosts. Cloud started to buzz with power right after the level shot up, and that clash pushed his score higher by a few points. Then the boy finally began to pry his eyes open again. Klaus's mind screamed that he'd never see anything again, and when he finally snapped back, he was convinced his eyes were already open. Yet he didn't know if it was over or where Merrim had gone. The guy's thoughts kept pouring out, and the voice way out in the distance begging God finally heard him breathing and prayed he was still alive, saying the clouds could take a break for now, but he had to stay awake. His voice faded into nothing, and then slowly, Clouds blinked his eyes open, while something soft pressed into his hands like a squeezable little toy. Soon, Klaus's eyes finally locked onto what was happening there. The guy sat at the dining table, clutching a small, fresh bun of bread. Then, out of nowhere, Liz called his name. The girl jabbed at her plate with her fork, then snapped her eyes to her brother. He barked for her to stop right away, and Liz quickly learned, you don't mess with food. Klaus was hit with the biggest shock. Seeing Liz here felt unreal. Like the one guy who should have been elsewhere was somehow home right now, hanging out with his sister, and then he glanced out at the street where little birds fluttered around. Klaus kept scanning the area, then spun around to face the other way, and right after, he opened his mouth, telling everyone exactly how he felt about the man who just battled on that snowy mountain. Liz snapped, asking what happened next, and Klaus stared at his sister in shock, then asked if she remembered the part from 10 minutes and 28 seconds ago. And when he finally landed the last hit, it all crashed back, every moment of what had happened to him. Liz's voice cut in. He dropped unconscious right after. Klaus snapped, frantic, so that's true. And Liz agreed instantly, while the girl added, yeah, Klaus was already at his limit in that very moment. Then Liz started rattling off what she saw right then. A calm face and a body stone cold, and the guy shot up from his seat without a second to waste. Klaus clenched the bread even tighter in his hands, his idea suddenly feeling terrifying. Then the guy in front of him slowly asked, so are you in heaven now? Liz started to shake, then she snapped at her brother and swore that wasn't true, before she turned to Klaus and demanded he stop spouting nonsense or else she'd act. Then she jabbed her brother with a fork, nearly touching him, and warned, if you don't stop, you'll end up in paradise. Her eyes looked unreal. The thought hit him out of nowhere. Wake up. Now, he snapped his eyes open and realized he was still gripping something in his hand. Klaus sprawled under a tiny blanket while all the guy's ammunition was stripped away, and there was a girl right beside him, hugging him tight as if they'd both fallen asleep in the exact same embrace. The main character snapped to the truth. This wasn't paradise at all, so he yanked his hand back fast, practically cringing as he tried to cover his eyes, while the girl who was already awake gave him a bright, good morning. Maureen shot up out of nowhere, caught Klaus staring at her, and snapped, stop looking at me. Klaus immediately tried to defend himself, claiming it was an accident. Because Maureen had spent ages trying to prove she wasn't a girl at all, Klaus finally snapped, pointing at her and yelling that she was cheating on him. Then Maureen swung her boot and fired back, calling him silly. After Maureen's scream tore through the air and Klaus snapped his head away, the young man just froze silently, staring into a dead empty corner, while Klaus could practically feel the shock crashing over him. He barely made it back from death, jolted awake to find a stunning girl sitting right beside him, like unreal, and with a figure that had him stunned. Then Klaus snapped back to his senses and swore it was all in his head. He felt a strange ache and tightness spread through his body, so he stared down at his arms and legs only to realize every single limb was wrapped up again, just like always with Mary. A sharp tingle kept clawing at the young man's nerves without letting up, and he couldn't figure out why, while Klaus slowly started loosening the body. The moment his hand made contact, pain detonated and he blurted out a cry. Maureen thrust her hand out and begged Klaus to stop making any sudden moves. Klaus immediately started firing questions about his hands, and the girl snapped back. He'd suffered frostbite in both his hands and feet, and it had been so bad he almost died. She told him she saved his life with one lightning-fast choice, and Klaus stared right through the girl as she kept piling up her accusations. The guy finally realized he'd been seconds from dying and his sister was 100, right about how insanely dangerous Klaus's skill really is. Cloud started to slowly remember every single thing that went down on the battlefield. Once her screaming finally died down, Klaus let out a calm breath, and the moment he caught himself, he realized she'd truly changed, and it was all thanks to what she'd been through. Right away, in her usual style, Maureen flashed a big thumbs up and grinned wide. Then the girl laughed along, saying he couldn't catch everything because friends always have each other's backs. Klaus shot upright, started dressing right away, and blurted out how grateful he was, then promised he'd return the favor and once again insisted they still weren't friends. Rage flared in Maureen as she demanded to know why Klaus was so cruel, and she begged him to stop being stubborn. Then Klaus snapped back to shut her up, claiming he'd just realized that Maureen was a girl. Yanking his already dried gear off the sticks by the campfire, Klaus bolted to one of their makeshift walls and carved out a clean sheet of snow with his knife, then knocked it loose fast. The young man stormed outside and scanned the area, desperate to size up what was happening and sniff out any clues, while Maureen pressed to the window, watching the snow fall like the world was holding its breath. After that, Clue whipped around and told the girl straight up he had no clue why Maureen wanted to be friends with him so badly, especially since, like she'd already seen, he definitely wasn't the strongest adventurer. Miriam let out a grin, saying her laugh was basically the skill she has kicking in. Klaus grilled her again, and she blurted out right away that she had a crazy gift called premonition. Klaus hauled the girl out of the snow tent and kept listening as Miriam explained she'd never mess up, not even once, because she followed her own skill. The girl laughed that she always finds him wherever a clown shows up, but when she got up, she still had to decide whether to trust her gift or ignore it. Then she grinned, saying he was no easy target, so she went with him. Marie flashed a grin, asked what Klaus was going to do next, and then leaned in. Time was running out fast, so she taunted him. Would he really throw in the towel? That snapped the guy's fuse. Klaus hurled his bag over his shoulder and said they couldn't wait for him to put his hand down, and then the guy told Marine they were moving out. Finally, the finish line they'd been chasing blinked into view on the horizon, a ghoul. Cloud warned them it was a dangerous monster. Sure, he might not be super fast, but that guy hits like a demon and doesn't slow down. Klaus then said the ghoul rules were simple. All you needed were two things: carcasses and raw earth, because once those were in place, ghouls of different kinds could show up, so you'd better watch your step. Klaus mumbled through a mouthful that they needed a plan, and after being on the road forever, the guy finally snagged his sister's bonito. Now it tasted better than any delicacy out there. Klaus clutched the reins and said, "Of course I already had this whole plan mapped out." Marine froze with shock, then snapped, "But with everything you've done, there's one problem." Miriam sat right behind him, clutching her bento tight in her hand, and said the ghouls were already wiped out, only no fresh ones had popped up yet, so she told him to go hunt someone else. Plus snapped that they'd only wiped out the weaker ghouls, sure, the little ones were fragile and barely had any smarts. Maureen then backed it up, none of the weak ones remained. After a few bites, Klaus grinned and said everyone else was gone except the little ones, and then he shrugged, saying the average is just a mess while his goal sits way above it. Mariam snapped her gaze at him, clearly unimpressed, and said it was just too much. She even admitted she didn't think they'd survive the supreme ghoul. Klaus stared at the panel and said, "That's exactly what the auto mode reads, but with only 7 hours left in the exam, there was no way they could cram everything in," and Marine couldn't believe how insanely cool Klaus's skill was. Then Klaus stared at the task for Mary Callum and snapped that only herb collecting would actually work for her, because throwing monsters and everything turns brutal fast. Still, they had no choice. They had to go hunt ghouls. Marine kept scanning the area, gushing about how insanely cool that guy's skill was, and she flat out promised him the job as an informant would pay him big. Klaus snapped around and told Lee how his skills had already exposed the very information he'd found before, because when you're staring down a giant ghoul, nobody knows what's about to hit them. Klaus asked Maureen if she was really ready to move on. Knowing what waited ahead, she grinned right back, her hands practically itching with anticipation, and with the meal already done, it was time to pack up and go. Kloof grinned and said he was in, so they slammed the gas and tore down the road at full speed, because their next stop was the old church, where they were supposed to finally find the one they'd been hunting. Then Klaus snapped his eyes onto the donkey and told the girl he'd slipped it a pill that could crank up its speed by a crazy 40, so Marine better be ready. She burst into laughter, swearing this time they'd never topple like last round, because she was already locked in then. Right before the thought even finished, Klaus hit his skill. So once they cranked up the cargo donkey speed, they had to reach the church in just under 3.5 hours. Then the timer started bleeding down, slowly slipping towards zero. Time dragged on, and then boom, Klaus snapped his eyes open and smiled like a vow, announcing they'd finally arrived. He stared at the building ahead and said, "Dead serious. That's the old church." Klaus kept pushing his eyes ahead, whispering that a dungeon sat under the church itself, one he'd never even stepped into, and the moment he said it, it felt thrilling and deadly. Klaus also said it was possible the same people who'd been playing dirty against them back then, those pens of gain, finally tracked their way here. But the moment it was his turn, the guy snapped that he could never take out the boss. The moment Klaus finished talking, silence hit no answer at all. The guy whipped around, panic crawling in his chest. Terrified he'd lose her. He heard someone moaning softly down below, snatched up his bulky raincoat, and saw Maureen gripping it like her life depended on it, clinging with every ounce of strength. Tears shimmered in Maureen's eyes, but the girl kept insisting, voice shaking, that she wasn't scared at all, not even a little, and she begged Klaus off to believe her. Then she started breaking down every move in pieces, laughing that the river made it feel effortless for her, while in skill mode, Klaus always zeroed in on the shortest route. Klaus soothed the girl, then snapped, "We've got barely any time, move." They forked over the entrance fee, 2 bronze coins each, and rushed inside. Klaus marched ahead with a lamp in hand. Yeah, even that was something we rented upstairs from the people running this place, while Maureen trailed right behind, constantly swiveling her eyes like she expected trouble to pop out any second. Mariam spun around, trying to swear to herself she wasn't scared of the dead bodies rotting in that crypt while her whole body still shook uncontrollably. Then she recoiled, gripped her staff even tighter, and blurted that, yeah, these places are way too gloomy for a girl. Klaus decided to torment the girl, snatched a lamp, held it to his head, and then boom, he blasted her with a loud, hoarse voice. And the second he started wheezing, Maureen screamed and thrashed all over the floor like clockwork. After Maureen cooled her temper by sprinting after the guy for a beat, she snagged the lead and lifted the lantern from Klaus. Then Klaus leaned in and asked, "So how well do you really know this place?" Maureen admitted she had zero clue about this dungeon then. As they pushed deeper, they hit a brutal door, and right after it, the dangerous depths truly opened up. Klaus unlatched the metal bolt, peering through it to spot whoever was still up ahead, and just like that, only on the 6th floor, he declared, "All clear." The guys were already on edge, tense, like something bad was about to snap. One dude even warned them that long before they ever started building this city, a dungeon was already here, and to wipe it out, the people built a church. Yeah, the dungeon was way too deep, and that church they built barely made a dent. Miasma kept piling up slowly, until one day they finally noticed, right as the danger started to snowball. After that, the guy told me, "Look, people still get dragged in from time to time." And then he explained how the A-rank adventurers would wipe the floors clean, smashing the monsters the moment they started getting too high. Klaus snapped in frustration, saying the adventurers had stopped showing up because the pay they'd been offered lately was pitiful. Then he reminded everyone, this is a church, so their assignments count as a tribute to the ministry. Klaus then said the reason was clear so they wouldn't be taken, and right after that, every door shut tight, sealed with every kind of lock, because they couldn't let the most dangerous one crawl out. The girl asked again the moment she realized the deadliest one was here. Then she suddenly heard something and snapped to the side, screaming, "What was that?" Klaus kept moving forward with that calm grin and told us the monster sometimes heads upstairs. Then he warned that if it does, Maureen has to bolt immediately. The girl had no clue what Klaus was talking about, and Maureen swore he was just messing with her until Klaus snapped that he was dead serious. He'd buy time by acting as bait, and Maureen would break for it and run. Maureen tried to object, but Klaus cut her off right away. His return function would yank him upstairs automatically, no ifs, no buts, and it would bring him back while everything else ran on autopilot. Klaus trudged on ahead and, without even looking back, told her he'd been overjoyed she'd saved him from the Yeti, so he refused to let her die. That's why he pushed Maureen to run. She grinned and promised she would. Then warned him, Klaus is the type who can't resist showing off. Then the girl slid her hand onto his shoulder and told him he probably forgot something, because her premonition kicked in at once, screaming that danger was right around the corner. Circling the guy, Mareem tossed out that line escape was still on the table no matter what. Then, even without leaning on Klaus's skills, she added with total confidence that he could count on her completely. The clown grinned and swore he trusted the girl. Then Maureen snapped, "All right, speed it up." And when she spotted the door to the 10th floor, her voice dropped as she declared the dungeon was finally starting. Some floor up, Klaus blared that their mark was a huge ghoul, then told everyone to duck behind the weaklings and strike from the back. The target guy shot his hand up, practically cheering at what he just heard. Merrim snapped at the guy that he was wrong, and Klaus fired back, all fired up, saying this time, Merrim absolutely couldn't fail him with that fireball, because it mattered more than anything. They kept plunging down floor after floor until they finally reached the door of the 15th floor, and the dungeon's air was already screaming that a monster was about to strike. A tiny bat fluttered in and delivered a folded letter to its owner, warning them that visitors had arrived on the dungeon floor. The mouse's owner claimed he'd come for all of this, at last. Then the girl calmly sipped her tea and shrugged that Klaus did it, Sure, but it was all for nothing. Now there was no choice left. She unleashed her doll army and started toying with the guy. It was Mika Kisaragi, part of Class A's special bond group too, because this girl could breathe life into anything. And yeah, she turned those inanimate dolls into servants. Just above one of those doors, the guild finally left its message confirming that the dungeon starts next, and the guild staff even begged the adventurers to shut the door behind them before they moved on. Clouds wrapped around the handle and yanked the door open, guiding the way straight to the floor. Right away, they saw a whole swarm of miasmas and monsters, ghostly ectoplasm oozing everywhere, totally formless and shapeless. Plus shot his hand up, eyes shining, grin stretched across his face, just like he'd pictured it. Then the guy blurted out that it was an awesome dungeon. Mareem flipped the script. She screamed the second she saw everything unfold. The moment they hit the floor, Mareem's skill snapped into action at once, and a nasty sense of dread hit her like a punch. Marien kept warning, "This place is a death trap." Her skill blared nonstop, like it was screaming that nobody could last here for long, and Cloud snapped. Then we moved fast, like we planned. Deeper into the dungeon, Klaus gripped a bone like he'd done in the cemetery, then crouched behind a column and peeked out again and again, gauging every shift in the danger. Marie stayed out into the hall for ages, hovering by the door until Klaus could finally be sure he'd take the right path, because while she kept herself safe, her power didn't slow down, and she still listened to him through the corridors, terrified that something would catch her. Klaus called out to the girl and grinned. "This part's easy. I'll be the bait and go first, just like we planned. Once I spot the ghoul, I'll bolt and start running, so it follows me." Then the guy bolts toward the safe zone, still taunting the monster that's hot on the target's heels, and when it finally cuts loose, there's a nasty little pile of bodies waiting. The second that ghoul shows up, Miriam will burst out of this pile and blast it with her fireball, burning the monster straight as it charges into the trap. Marine snapped into a rage scream, furious at the algorithm, because she couldn't wrap her head around why the girl had to be made to wait in a pile of corpses just to cry. Klaus only shrugged and called it a necessity. Grinning, the guy snapped that it was time to quit the games and jump straight into the real plan. Then Klaus immediately pointed out that the automatic function comes with its own nasty drawbacks. He warned them that beyond this point lies the territory of death, so they had to blast life back into this safe zone as hard as they could, and then he looked straight at Mary, telling her he trusted her to watch his back. Maureen tapped him lightly on the head with her staff and snapped that if he wanted the girl to do it, he'd better not rile her up, while Klaus Grind apologized, trying to cool things down and lighten the mood. Then Klaus fired off, telling them it was time to go all in and make their move, while the guy grinned, convinced their plan to hunt the big ghoul was flawless and would work. So Miriam stayed planted in the safe zone while Klaus pushed forward, and this empty floor felt deadly because the danger was supposed to be getting worse, not disappearing. Miriam snapped at the guy, yelling at Klaus to be careful because her gut feeling hasn't eased one bit since that moment, and this premonition is about to slam through every limit sooner than later. In a softer voice, Mariam admitted she had this gut feeling if she dared to look back right now, the god of death himself would be standing right in front of her instantly. As she stood there, something in the air started pressuring her to look back. Then she spun around and froze at the sight of a towering, glowing ghoul with a freakishly weird head shape. She couldn't wrap her head around why this monster showed up here. This was a safe zone where the ghouls couldn't cross, locked behind a seal on the doors. Marine kept her eyes locked on that monster far off. Then it exploded into motion and sprinted straight for her, and the second it charged, she screamed, totally frozen because she had no idea what to do next. Maran had to steady her breath because if she froze, she'd be dead. So she slammed energy into her staff and unleashed a blazing fireball. That ghoul was so huge and packed with muscle that the magic hardly even registered, and he kept sprinting. Then the ball ricocheted off to the side. The girl froze, sure this had to be some kind of joke, because the ghoul still redirected that ball with his hand, and Klaus carefully fired the pass right after it. Klaus scanned the area and couldn't believe it. No enemies anywhere, so he checked again, fired off a 3rd level presence reading, and instantly clocked exactly where the ghouls had slipped off to. Klaus lunged ahead, and the moment the monsters realized they'd been spotted, they bolted into attack because the guy couldn't wrap his head around ghouls showing that kind of intelligence, hiding in wait like they'd been planning it all along. He swung straight for a ghoul's head, then his weapon exploded into shrapnel the second it connected. The ghoul kept staring at him like it was taunting him, a sly grin creeping across its face, and Klaus just couldn't believe it, because he hadn't landed a single hit yet. The guy didn't take a shred of damage. The second ghoul, still trailing behind, swept a leg out and hurled the guy across the corridor like it was nothing, and Klaus just stared, realizing this wasn't some average level at all. This was the highest of the high. He slammed down in a painful thud, still gripping his shattered knife, and before he could even breathe, Maureen barreled over and started helping him up, demanding, "Are you okay?" Clues winced so hard his face twisted in pain, admitting he'd only flown for a bit. Then he hurriedly apologized to Mary and confessed the dungeon still felt wildly strange. He popped open the panel, cursed under his breath, and muttered that this had to be true. There was no ghoul here, not one, because the automatic system only fired when those exact conditions hit. If everything was going to work, this guy had to have battled one monster or another before. But what if it was the kind of thing that only counts when you actually land a hit last time? Klaus knew they had to move no time for hesitation because he didn't have a trump card left, and he had to scramble his way out of this chaos while keeping Mary safe. The ghouls closed in around the two adventurers, and right in their hands, the marriage, whatever it was, pushed them to fight harder, lifting the guy again and again while they kept roaring. That the real mission is simple, don't you dare give up. She also said it clear Klaus isn't the only one to blame. She's messed up too, and she knows it, but her gut, her premonition is screaming at her not to quit right now. Mariam clung to Klaus's shoulders and begged him, again and again, not to quit. Those words slammed into Nordal's mind and somehow lit the fuse that made Klaus finally dig deep and keep going. Mariam said they'd beat all of this, no doubt, and Klaus shot upright, ready to move, declaring that then they'd start hunting right away. Like Cloud warned, they stumbled straight into a brutal mess, one monster looming right ahead, two more closing in from behind, and every single one of them felt impossibly strong. Then, bam, another sound ripped through the air and the whole floor practically shook. Cloud whipped his head around and Mareem instantly lunged forward, shoving that guy aside. With a deafening crash, another intruder staggered into the floor corridor, shattering the marble columns in their path. Mary barely managed to stop the clouds from getting wiped out. Then there was another ghoul. Nothing like the usual monsters, he towered over everyone, and he was a brute with 2.5 times the health of the other three. And just like that, things spiraled again. 4 higher ghouls crept closer, herding the guys into a tight corner as they ducked behind a busted column. Klaus spun around and locked eyes on an iron poker. No fancy gear, just raw metal. He realized he'd been stripped of any real weapon, and right then, that poker was his only shot. With Maureen in his arms, Klaus leaned in and whispered, "It's okay, I've lived with this for a long time." The guy promised he'd fix everything right now, and then Maureen snapped. "Hey!" Mareem's eyes brimmed with tears as she frantically jabbed at the blocked exit, shouting that he was buried under rubble. The girl's hands started trembling even worse as she shouted Klaus's name, and in a shaky whisper, she demanded, "Why aren't we attacking yet?" Klaus then let out a fierce howl, convincing himself everything was okay and there was nothing to panic about. When Miriam grilled him, Cloud shrugged and said the ghouls might just be trying to freak them out. Or worse, they're huddled up, deciding who gets eaten first. Clues gave a jittery smile, then blurted out that they had to be gourmets, while Marine's face twisted in horror, because deep down he knew he'd probably taste better than Klaus. "So yeah, no more jokes," Maureen snapped. "What's the plan?" Klaus answered. "While those monsters are busy playing, we either bolt right now or we make a real escape plan on the spot." Klaus cracked open his panel and told them escaping would take a brutal 100 hours. And when the guy pressed him about Maureen following, she straight up said she couldn't because she'd die. Your second option was to charge into the fight because the monsters didn't show up just from the skill. The girl asked if this was the power she used to crush the ice giants, and then she added that she could help too. The clouds warned him he couldn't fire the skill yet because it only kicks in after the fight with that monster is already finished. He even remembered the moment he lunged in with a knife but it didn't scratch the monster at all, so the guy just figured, "Fine, I'll hit harder." Klaus knew right away this wasn't going to be some easy stomp taking down. Those three was brutal, and even landing a little damage on them cost him everything. Suddenly, Klaus caught a crazy detail. He spotted the ghoul's hand first, the same one Mariam had seen, and right on his arm sat a tiny burn. Klaus nudged the girl and demanded she look too, then he whipped around to ask Maureen what that big ghoul had on its arm up close. It looked like a tiny wound. While Klaus was too busy getting jumped by two ghouls to even notice, the girl stepped in and said it might have been the fireball. Then she hurriedly apologized, admitting she'd only meant to offend him a little. Right then, they locked eyes, sharp, instant, undeniable. Both of them hit the exact same thought at once and shouted it out, "Fire is a ghoul's weakness." The girl started loading her staff with laser-focused care, and in a hushed whisper, she swore that no matter how savage these monsters got, they still had that one fatal weakness: fire. Mariam kicked off her witchcraft and kept rattling out a growing fire attack, forcing the guy to swear everything would be okay. Then begged him not to die on her once the charge finally maxed out. She and the others moved, and she hurled the fireball free. The ball shot straight at one of the ghouls, and the moment it landed, it immediately darted after the same prize while the guy gripped his fresh weapon up high, now wrapped with a little bit of cloth on the blade. As he sprinted, Klaus blasted the fabric with a fireball, torching it in seconds. Now he was primed to rain destruction on what lay dead. That was the whole plan. Klaus slammed one with a poker as a teasing fireball streaked onto his skill panel, then 4 dead men flared into view, and the clock was ticking only 24 minutes to deal with them. Right after that, Klaus immediately burst out of the monster's counterstrike, slipped right under its hand, and shouted to Mary that everything was set, then promised it would all take exactly 24 minutes and 13 seconds. Merim shot a nervous glance at the guy, stunned by how long it was taking because the last time, he mowed down 8 giants in about 10 minutes. The ghoul slashed again, and somehow Klaus's blade met it. He actually caught the swing just in time with the weapons in his hands. Then the automatic combat mode snapped on, firing the moment it triggered. Suddenly, Maureen clocked that Klaus had no weapon, so she figured he couldn't trigger his skill, but Klaus was already moving, and all 4 ghouls came swarming through the air at him. Klaus started deflecting and dodging, then yanked the arm off one of the skinny ghouls and snapped it clean off. Merim stared in shock, mouth hanging open, because she couldn't wrap her head around what Klaus was pulling off. His insane skill flipped the same top-tier monsters right against themselves, and they started destroying each other with every brutal strike. As he hit the ground and crouched, one enemy blasted, sending the other's head flying clean off to the side. The machine crunched the numbers and clocked it 24 minutes to go toe-to-toe with 4 ghouls. One of the long-haired ghouls lunged in with his weapon, but the main character snapped out of the way with a clean dodge. Suddenly, the blade rockets straight at Klaus, yet, with his eyes still shut, he shoots out his hand and stops it mid-swing. At that exact moment, he yanked the ghoul in by its collar so hard the enemy spun midair, then her weapon snapped toward a whole other ghoul. The main character threw himself to the ground just in time, and the ghoul's weapon sliced off the second enemy's arm mid-swing. Klaus yanked the victim by the arm and slammed him to the ground with brutal force. And the next moment, they both turned on the main character. Suddenly, he was right in the chaos. Then, bam! Something wild happened. The enemy squads broke into pairs and started wiping each other out. Only 2 ghouls still stood alive, dangerous and furious, and when they spotted the boy, they snapped their heads up and surged in to attack him again. Mariam had no clue what was happening. Then she watched Klaus and went, "Wait, how is this so brilliant? Their magic didn't even scratch them. Their bodies were just too tough. So yeah, there's nothing left but for them to off themselves." And Cloud set the whole trap on purpose, making them clash right there, spiraling around in a tiny little space until they turned on each other. She couldn't help asking if anyone out there could even invent something like this or pull it off with sheer brain power, all on their own. With that method in mind, Maureen stared at the guy and realized one thing. His tower was still missing. Those clouds kept rolling like a perfect cover, keeping his eyes sealed, while he moved with deadly skill. Then thoughts started slipping through his head as he told Maureen, "My job is to fight, you have to find a way out." The moment he realized the auto combat had kicked in, burning fire tying it all together, his guard shot up. Because the real question was terrifying: what was going to happen to him after the fight? Clouds knew that if he smashed them, more enemies would rush in right then, and he didn't know what would hit them next. The automatic system couldn't just snap back on. The thoughts kept slamming through my mind. Then Maureen's anger flared as she snapped that their role split was unfair, that his jobs were far more dangerous, but Klaus calmly told her not to worry. He flashed a confident smile at the girl, shoved his fear down, and told her he truly believed in Mareem's amazing premonition. Then he locked eyes with Mareem and urged her to believe it too. Mareem can't help but clock what a total goofball he is. Yeah, she doesn't come out and say everything's awful, but don't mistake her silence for things going great either. The girl even figured this might be a real win-win until after the guy battled the giants and passed out for the whole night, and she realized this enemy was way tougher. Mareem leaned in and told him she understood it all. Then she shouted after him that he couldn't go dying in those 24 minutes, and if he was wiped out after the fight, she'd still drag his body away from here. Maureen almost believed him until that bad gut feeling snapped into something worse. And right then, Klaus was still locked in his fight with the ghouls. With only one ghoul left, the last one they managed to scorch with a fireball, then he jerked his head up and charged straight at Klaus. His head began to pry itself open slowly, revealing what was inside, the whole time a mouth packed with razor-sharp teeth. Klaus darted behind a pillar and grabbed something lying on the floor. Our Chloe Yus raised a blade-like hand once belonging to a girl who was also a ghoul, and the monster lunged, jaws wide, straight for the boy. With one brutal slash, the last monster's head ripped clean off and hit the ground. Then the ghoul staggered a few steps forward and crumpled, going totally still, and the timer stopped dead. The moment Klaus's skill finally quit, it yanked at his body like a trap, and he coughed hard blood splattering from his mouth before his eyes even fully opened. Then he crumpled onto his side. Maureen suddenly felt that something was bearing down on them, while the skill warned that the danger was coming from behind or rising from below, and that this was peak, can't ignore danger. Klaus kept writhing on the ground in agony then. Once the pain loosened just enough for him to snap back to reality, he started rummaging through his own pockets, digging for something. He jolted forward and yanked out a tiny ampule packed with a supercharged healing potion, the same kind Tiela once handed him. He felt instantly better, and Klaus finally understood why he bought it in the first place, because that guy still remembered the elf's warning: if he didn't want to die, he'd better spend the money. The whole class stared ahead and saw the monsters' bodies lying still, lifeless, and motionless. Then the guy finally understood he'd actually pulled off the win and defeated Ford. He groaned as he shoved himself off the floor, realizing he wasn't giving up, But this was just a slice of what they still had to do here, and the struggle only got harder, forcing him to figure out his next move. The door still blocked suddenly slammed shut like someone yanked it from the other side, or like she snapped it closed herself. Either way, it meant monsters weren't the ones doing things this clean, and that was downright terrifying. Right after Klaus spun toward the door, he instantly heard multiple hits thunder into it. Then, when he peered through the bolt, he spotted a whole swarm of ghouls and screamed Mareem's name. Footsteps came charging toward Klaus, and he knew the sound wasn't ghouls because the door only seals the exit. Somewhere behind him, his blouse heard it and realized the guy was completely useless. Down the corridor, a whole swarm of objects surged toward him, held aloft by hands, pushing a palanquin with its owner sealed inside, and the second Klaus laid eyes on it, she felt painfully, terrifyingly familiar. Terror hit the boy the instant he heard her voice, and he realized it was Misa Kisaragi. He jabbed a finger at her and shouted that it was her, the special bond member who could give life with her skill. Misa shot a warning look, jabbing her finger as she yelled that the kid was talking to her in a total inappropriate way. He just kept calling her Misa like he had no clue who he was messing with. The girl snapped her hand toward the guy, and in the next breath, her soldiers surged in with long steel claws, reaching him before he could even blink. Klaus spun around, baffled who built this army. They weren't ghouls, they weren't zombies, and then it hit him, the girl's power. If she could do that, she could probably wrestle control of inanimate objects. 3 years ago, Misa bragged that she could bend any object she wanted, then admitted she was at her absolute best when it came to puppets shaped like people. Cloud barked, "You're dead," as she stared straight into their faces because those weren't just victims. They were her dolls, and she'd been steering them like puppets to break the boy. Misa told Klaus he'd nailed it, then proudly called her fresh army this, while admitting she dressed them up, and finally she hit him with a sarcastic, "So what do you think of my masquerade, huh?" Then the girl revealed there were people who fed the ghouls too. Klaus totally had no idea what she meant, until Misa snapped in and said ghouls change when they munch on corpses, and that's why she fed those four. Klaus instantly clocked it. Misa was the one who twisted those monsters into what they were. Then one of her lackeys slammed the guy down, and Misa just kept cackling like it was all part of the show. The girl bragged that it was downright noble of her to turn useless dead people into something useful. Then she flashed an even scarier grin and told Klaus it was his turn to sleep here forever, before thanking him for driving the boredom away. Misa finally spilled the truth to Klaus at first. She had totally different plans for him, but then she remembered she could put on a special performance for herself. And yeah, she could tell Klaus was feeling pretty discouraged right now. Klaus swung the bit of blade he still had and hacked off several hands from the doll beside him. Then he snapped at the girl, furious, asking whether she actually enjoyed messing with the exam. Misa let out a vile cackle, screaming that the clouds should start dying because Gein's got a bonus waiting for taking that guy out. And Misa's about to share her unique skill with him. Klaus whipped his hand up and yelled that he wouldn't do it. But the other guy stared him down and snapped that a full minute had already passed since he'd needed to get his strength back. Klaus will wipe out every one of Misa's subordinates in just 5.5 minutes. Then he barks at her to hold on for a second because he's about to ruin her performance himself. Misa snapped that she wasn't some nobody like Klaus, she'd grown stronger over this time, powerful enough to take down a massive wave of dead bodies, and the crazy part is, she couldn't even figure out why that guy would risk something like this. Mela kept talking, firing back that Klaus had totally underestimated her, like that move was pointless, and because of that, he was going to vanish as nothing but dead weight. Klaus has already kicked on his ability, and now he's mowing down every enemy in his path, blade flying. He kept on carving with the Supreme Ghoul's blades, the ones he'd only just brought down. Misa stared in stunned silence, and then her expression snapped as she saw that monster wipe out her entire army of the dead with ruthless ease. She couldn't wrap her mind around why this was happening, and before she could react, Klaus charged at her while Mela barked for her team to start shooting at the boy. For Klaus, it wasn't a problem at all. He just started juking every crossbow bolt that came screaming his way, and not a single one hit him. The girl stared in horror as all that was left of her army crumbled into nothing, and even now, she couldn't wrap her head around it. She'd always thought that boy was a total jerk, so how was he even holding up? 26 of the 49 dead have already been handed a death sentence, and Klaus kept swinging those blades, eyes shut tight, until he landed on the ones holding the stretcher, where Misa instantly went down, nose first, right into the floor. All the girl could think about was one brutal truth: she'd lost everything. How could it happen? Because Klaus was useless. She stared at herself, panicking as she realized she'd smeared her own clothes with blood. Blood she couldn't explain. She snatched a handkerchief, wiped her nose hard, and refused to believe anyone would dare laugh because she'd already cleared the 100th level and she was not about to let this end without paying it back. Misa shot back up, steam rising because an A-rank adventurer got taken down by some low-tier nobody. This was never going to slide. Then they shouted. They were coming for Klaus, saying they'd destroy him. She flashed a grin and already knew she wouldn't even bother masking it like some accident because he's going to ruin her. And honestly, it doesn't matter if she ends up accused, not after everything she's decided. Misa figured she could do anything she wanted. All because she was riding shotgun with Gavin. He had the right connections, so punishment was basically off the table for her. The girl yanked out a dagger and charged at him, screaming that she'd ruined his life. Then she snapped that he'd never pass the exam anyway because they'd already bribed everyone. She also warned that without leveling up into a middle rank adventurer, he'd be dead for good right now. She made it clear no matter how hard Klaus begged for mercy, she wouldn't give him a single drop. He lunged in, slammed her weapon out of her hands, and then finished off the last dead man right there with him. The timer finally ran out. Klaus snapped his eyes open, scanning his surroundings, while Misa lay right at his feet, staring up at the guy. Klaus threw the blade over his shoulder and demanded to know what Misa was going on about.